Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was a gloriously beautiful sunny day in the Blue Ridge Mountains of West Virginia in the summer of 1932, as Mrs. Evangeline Thrift hung out her washing on the line. She glanced up at the vast expanse of the cobalt blue sky as a white bird soared above her head, towering in the sky like a whimsical children's kite, almost sailing with the wind, as there was a gentle but sweeping breeze blowing that day. I wonder what kind of a bird that is, she thought, placing a wooden peg in her mouth, which she clenched tightly with her teeth. Then she removed it to clasp the far corner of her pretty floral frock. Finally it was hanging on the line, where it blew backwards and forwards in the wind like a gushing sail. Her little Jack Russell Terrier was excitedly tearing around the yard, lifting its leg up on every available bush to mark his territory, as if to tell the entire world, or anyone who might be interested for that matter, that he had been there. As every bush, tree and flower, without discrimination or any form of prejudice, was saturated with his warm, virile essence. Evangeline glanced towards the sparkling, viridescent pretty views that surrounded her, as everywhere you looked there were trees, trees, and still more trees, along with the undulating sweeping curls of the mountains. Luckily she lived in a neighbourhood where the houses weren't too far apart from each other, where there were exquisite waterfalls, spectacular-looking wood groves, copious amounts of hiking trails, which meant there were so many places to enjoy al fresco picnics in pretty flowery meadows. She sighed happily, whistling a tune to herself as she went into the kitchen, bringing in the large bucket of wild berries she had collected earlier on in the day. Before long, Evangeline was buzzing away industriously in her kitchen, preparing dinner for when her husband Simon returned from helping the Godfreys to put up a new wicker fence to prevent their cows from wandering off, as a couple of them had ended up grazing in a neighbour's fields. Fortunately in town, her husband was always picking up odd jobs from the locals, and there was a note up in the baker's window saying, "Simon Thrift, handyman services available. No job too big or too small. Available on Mondays to Saturdays." By the time dinner had come and gone, Evangeline was beginning to worry about her husband. Where the heck had he got to, she wondered to herself, her forehead furrowing into deep worry lines. Should she be concerned, she wondered, or had her husband been sidetracked by one of the locals? Was he enjoying a little chinwag and a stiff tot of whisky? She certainly hoped the latter was the case, and almost suspected as much. All of a sudden she heard the familiar whizzing sound of her husband's bicycle riding down the path towards their farmhouse, followed by the habitual customary thumping sound of the bike being placed haphazardly against the yard shed. Then she heard the squeaking sound of familiar boots, finally heading towards the back door that led towards the kitchen. It creaked wide open, and standing there as a dense, dark, shadowy silhouette in the twilight stood the tall, distinguishable figure of her husband. A fragrant relief infused her heart gratefully. She was so glad that Simon was safely back, but ever so slightly aggrieved at the same time, as he had left her feeling more than a little concerned. "Where have you been, Simon? Your dinner is now stone cold." Simon sat back on the quirky green gold-stripe upholstered chair in the far corner of the kitchen, lifting his boots up to his knees, untying the tangled laces, throwing them across the kitchen floor in a messy heap, a habit that Evangeline did not approve of, but she always bit her lip tightly, saying nothing. She didn't want to become the quintessential nagging wife that the Bible always referred to as being worse than a dripping tap. "Oh, that's much better," he sighed, rubbing his toes through his socks briefly, massaging the underside of his feet. "It's been one hell of a day. Is there anything to eat? I'm half starved. I could eat an entire turkey." Evangeline bustled towards the stove to warm up a piece of meatloaf drenched in a plethora of gravy for her husband, which she served with biscuits. He ate hungrily, not saying a word, barely stopping to draw breath between ravenous mouthfuls. She couldn't help but notice that her young husband looked frazzled, worn out, jaded, exhausted even, which was unusual for him, as he normally was buzzing with life like a hyperactive bee. But not tonight. He was different this evening. "How did the installation go with the wicker fence?" she asked. "Did you complete the job?" "It didn't go at all," said her husband. "A little girl visiting from the Big Apple went missing on a family picnic. The family were visiting friends who lived here, so they're not familiar or acquainted with the area. The girl was playing by the creek with her brother, only a few feet away from the adults, who were able to keep a vigilant eye on both of their kids. The little boy got distracted by a frog, was chasing after it to put in a bottle. When he turned around to show his sister his fabulous conquest, she had all but vanished. According to the family, 1 minute she was there, the next she was gone. Everyone in town was scaling the forest in a dreadful concern, but we found no sign of her. The whole family is completely devastated, while the boy is naturally terribly upset. Sadly, he blames himself. No one can fathom what could have happened to her, for during our search we found nothing, absolutely nothing. Everyone is naturally feeling very downcast. I can't imagine the grief the poor family is going through. The mother wouldn't stop screaming. You should have seen her. She was so distressed. Dr. Adams had to be called to sedate her." "And you're sure they looked absolutely everywhere? I mean, they didn't see some suspicious lowlife loitering around, or even a predatory mountain lion, perhaps? Something must have happened to her. You don't just disappear into thin air like that. You'd have expected to find some clues, surely." "Well, the family did say that when they arrived for the picnic, they saw a family of Roma gypsies with their wagon and horses parked outside the hiking trail. But after the young girl went missing, they were long since gone. So there is idle speculation that they might have been behind the kid's abduction. Suffice to say, those Roma gypsies are renowned for making mischief. We all know that very well. By all accounts, according to the boy's father, they looked more than a little shady, as if they were up to no good. I wish they'd go back to Eastern Europe. What are they doing out here in America? This is our country, our fine country. Why should we be invaded by all these migrants?" "So you saw no other clues, like a torn piece of fabric perhaps on a hedgerow, or something from the little girl?" "No, but we did see something very weird. We discovered in some of the muddy areas around the creek 18-inch footprints that were over 9 inches wide. Now I ask you, Evangeline, who has got feet that huge? There is no way those were bear prints. There were discernible toes on the print, very distinctive human toes." "But that's enormous! Who's got feet that big, apart from a circus clown when they wear those oversized shoes?" "Well, one of the locals said it could be a footprint from a hairy mountain giant. He believes there is a distinct possibility that a creature like that could have abducted the young girl. They're rumoured to live in the heart of the mountains, but from what I've gathered, they're benevolent. They have no real desire to interact with humans. My money's on the Roma gypsies. I'm certain they abducted her. They're behind her mysterious disappearance. I'm sure of it. The trouble is there's no way of tracking them. They've disappeared into the ether. never to be seen or heard from again. You know what those gypsies are like." "Hairy mountain giant," said Evangeline, looking nonplussed. "Well, I never. I've heard everything now." This happened 10 years before my grandmother was born. Evangeline was my mother Rachel's birth mother. The story of the missing girl that vanished 10 years prior had long since been extinguished, like the flame from a candle. Well, so it seemed. My grandmother was raised by Evangeline and Simon Thrift in a white symmetrical farmhouse with a pretty green trim, with a columned portico overlooking the stunning views of the Blue Mountains. They lived in a close-knit convivial community where everyone was well acquainted with each other. When my mother Rachel, Evangeline's oldest daughter, was 12 years old, a strange man moved into town. Everyone was talking about it, because, well, he wasn't from the Blue Mountains, so he stuck out like a sore thumb. The family was soon to learn that he'd moved into the late Miss Schreiner's farmhouse a little further down the road from the Thrift family home. I guess you could say he was in his late 20s or early 30s. Rachel had seen him at church one Sunday being welcomed to the town by the local pastor, who introduced the startled man to his entire flock. It would appear people were friendly towards him, but his attitude was oddly aloof and indifferent. It would seem tongues were wagging in the town faster than a feisty dog's tail, as people pondered as to who he was, what he was doing in town, why he was even there. I mean, why would someone from the Big Apple move to a small, remote, rural mountain town? "I don't know why everybody finds this so peculiarly odd," Evangeline had said over the dinner table one night, when mention of the new man in town was being discussed over dinner, as my mother Rachel and her brother Elijah listened in to the conversation, while they tucked hungrily into hearty bowls of beef stew and dumpling. "You know, it's perfectly natural for a writer to move to a beautiful part of the world," Evangeline was saying. "It's all about stimulating the flow of the creative juices. It invariably enables the writer to think of more inspirational subject matter, as ideas always flow so much easier in an aesthetically pleasing environment." "I suppose that makes sense," said Simon, rubbing his moustache reflectively. "But why our part of the world?" "Well, why not? Why not our part of the world?" Evangeline had challenged him. "Why ever not? It's very exquisite around here, I'll have you know. We have the crisp mountain air, sensational views, pretty flowery meadows, mountains. What's there not to like about this part of the world?" "Of course it's a beautiful part of the world, sweetheart. I agree. But why would he want to move to a small mountain town? He seems so conspicuous among the locals. A real fish out of the water, you could say. I'm sure he must feel it too. A little like an oddball coming from a big city like New York." "If you don't mind my saying so, Simon, you're being ridiculous. We don't have to be so parochial, insular, narrow-minded around here, do we? If a stranger wants to move into our midst, we need to make him feel welcome, not regard him with an obnoxious, illiberal suspicion. People around here need to be a little less provincial, much more open-minded. I'd hope if I moved to another American town that I'd also be made to feel welcome, or even a city like New York for that matter, although I dare say I would look like a little country bumpkin if I moved to New York. They're so much more sophisticated out there."
"It's not that, sweetheart. I guess there's something about this stranger that's a little, well, shall we say, idiosyncratic."
"I'll have you know, Simon, his name is Hugo Yarborough. It would be very nice if you could address the man courteously by his name. The only thing you find outlandish about him is he's refreshingly eccentric, and what's wrong with that? Would you discriminate against a Rhode Island red chicken if I introduced him to our Brahmas and Plymouth Rocks, just because he's different? Why, the notion is absolutely ridiculous."
"It's not the same thing."
"Well then, why is he peculiar to you?"
"Well, a couple of the locals have seen him wandering around the woods, behaving very, very strangely."
"Oh, for goodness sake, Simon, have people here not got anything better to do than fill their minds with this flaky, bubble-headed, preposterous reasoning? The poor man was possibly just exploring the countryside. What on earth is wrong with that? Give him a break, for goodness sake." One day my mother Rachel, who was 12 at the time, while her brother Elijah was 11, were both ambling down the country lane together. They happened to pass Mr. Yarborough,
at the very moment when he was driving out of his property in his dark green 1950s station wagon. They watched him driving down the precarious dirt road that was covered in potholes and lots of rocky debris, so the car invariably jiggled and jolted as it drove away, until it was just a shadowy speck on the horizon, or a faint speck of dust on the landscape. "Do you think he saw us?" Rachel whispered to her brother earnestly. "Does it even matter if he did?" asked Elijah. "We're just having a walk. Nothing uncustomary about that, surely." "I suppose not. Let's go and have a snoop around his property now that he's out the way. Maybe a door will be open somewhere. We can take a quick peek inside." "Go on, Elijah, it'll be fun. Aren't you just a teensy-weensy bit curious about the man? See if any of his novels are lying around the place. Mum thinks he might write murder mysteries. Wouldn't that be cool if we actually had a famous novelist in our midst? Murder mysteries! It doesn't get better than that. I bet you he's writing under an unassumed name." "All right," agreed Elijah. "I'm game. Let's do it." As Rachel and her brother Elijah reached the classic minimalistic farmhouse, it didn't appear unsimilar to their own. It was pretty, modest, a white symmetrical wooden two-storey building, with clean angular lines, a central porch that led directly to a pale blue front door. There was a long row of sashed windows on the upper and lower stories, arrayed in a perfect uniform sequence, all framed by attractive large shutters that looked like they cost a pretty penny, that were painted in a pale blue trim, while the roof of the house boasted a standard grey slate tile. It was so typical of a quintessential 1950s farmhouse, as there were no pretentious ornamentations or embellishments to the house, which expressed a straightforward, uncomplicated simplicity. An old, congenial, very friendly mixed-breed dog that looked like a mixture of Pyrenees Mountain and Labrador had been lying on the porch in an oversized basket. He exuberantly came bounding towards them, thrashing his tail backwards and forwards with an enthusiastic gusto, letting out the occasional excitable woof that expressed his extreme pleasure in encountering the two young trespassers. So a guard dog he was most certainly not. On the contrary, he was the kind of dog that would have invited an intruder into the home with a gleeful appreciation, not batting an eyelid if the entire house had been ramshackled and everything stolen. Rachel bent down to cuddle the dog, soaking her small fingers into his soft long fur, while her brother Elijah darted swiftly up the steps of the porch, pressing open the creaking front door that sounded as though it hadn't been oiled in many years. "It's open. We can have a good snoop." The front door opened out into a neat little entrance hall, which was painted in a grandiose vintage red colour, while a large abstract piece of art took central stage on the wall. There was a couple of smart upholstered gold and red striped chairs, and a small chestnut table sporting a vase of freshly cut summer flowers. The entrance hall opened out into a living room that was very cheerful for a young bachelor, boasting bright aquamarine walls, along with gold-coloured couches covered in a mirage of bright scatter cushions in different colours and designs, while on the wall were some framed pieces of colourful artwork, along with bookshelves bursting at the seams with books. There was a large, extravagant Persian rug gracing the wooden parquet floor, done in rich golds and reds, along with an eclectic light fitting dangling from the ceiling that looked much more like a contemporary work of art than a light fitting at all. "I'll give you this," whispered Rachel. "For a man living on his own as a bachelor, he hasn't half got good taste." It was when the two kids gravitated towards a room overlooking pretty views in the front yard, they stopped dead in their tracks. There was a lone typewriter on a desk with some paper inside it and words written on the page, which Rachel bent down to read out loud. "He's definitely a writer. Listen to this, Elijah." "We stood at the turning point. Half measures availed us nothing. And then look further down, it says, 'Murder filled us with a sense of dread, which didn't bode well with Madame de Bois.' I told you, I think he writes thrillers." "Look at this," said Elijah, opening up a large paper book filled with strange articles, along with pictures of a young blonde girl with blue eyes playing with a bucket and spade on a sandy beach, making sandcastles with a slightly older kid that looked like her brother. The newspaper article read, "Melissa Yarborough, a young 8-year-old girl, went missing on Saturday when picnicking with her family on the mountain farm trail that is easily accessible to members of the public. Mr. Yarborough affirmed that he and his family were picnicking in the wood grove opposite a pretty little creek. Our eyes were on the kids the whole time, he informed the Bluefield Sunset News. The kids were playing around in the water. My son Hugo was catching a frog. When he turned around, his sister had gone, vanished into thin air. It happened so fast, said Mr. Yarborough. It was like she completely disappeared off the face of the earth. A search party with hundreds of locals succeeded not in finding the missing girl, but postulating conjectures abounded, as Roma gypsies purported to have been parked close to the trail conveniently had absconded. Furthermore, things got exceedingly more bizarre to this intriguing outlandish case, as trails of freshly made oversized footprints that some hypothesize could belong to an elusive hairy mountain giant that is rumoured to inhabit the mountains were seen in a muddy location not far from where the child vanished. So what did happen to Melissa Yarborough is open to speculation, this mystery leaving many with more answers than questions. "Wow!" said Rachel, looking at her brother Elijah with wide, aghast eyes. "Don't you see? Hugo Yarborough must be the brother of the little girl that went missing around here. Look at the date. This happened in the 1930s, 20 years ago. I remember Mum telling me about a young girl going missing on that mountain farm trail. Don't you remember?" "That's weird," said Elijah. "Why would the girl's brother come back here?" Rachel surfed through the paper book to discover articles written about anomalous sightings of mountain giants in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It read, "Large footprints, not that of a bear, measuring 20 inches, have been spotted in remote wooded areas after heavy rainfall by hikers and hunters alike. Some claim to have seen a sighting of a giant humanoid-like beast, covered with long dark hair with gargantuan proportions that might even challenge the width and height of your front door. And we're not joking either." Mrs. Lacey Penbridge told the Post, "I've seen one myself when berry picking last summer. It was like a huge human being, but covered in hair. It watched me as it hid behind a large beech tree, but I saw it very clearly. Even if it was only for a minute, I know what I saw. Miss Penbridge is in no doubt what she saw. So is there a hairy giant-like beast living among us in the Blue Mountains? You decide." "Think about it, Elijah. Maybe Hugo thinks his sister's still alive somewhere, was abducted by a mountain giant, is living in a cave somewhere. Or maybe he just wants to be close to where his sister was last seen all those years ago. That's maybe why he came to this town. But I would questimate that he came here not just to write his books." "Wow, that's seriously weird," said Elijah. "And as for those fictitious so-called mountain giants, are they even real? My money's on those gypsies. They took her away. I'm certain of it." "Let's go," said Rachel suddenly. "We don't want that Hugo man to discover us ferreting around in his business." Many weeks passed, and Rachel and Elijah soon forgot about Mr. Hugo Yarborough. Before long the town began to find other things to gossip about, besides the slick, rather quirky character from the Big Apple that had settled in their part of the world, and was as out of place in West Virginia as a Kentucky pawpaw tree inhabiting the sub-zero conditions of the Alaskan wilderness. Regardless, however incongruous and incompatible to their town he may have seemed, after a while even the out-of-ordinary has a remarkable ability of settling into an environment, so that in no time at all the outlandish seems almost normal. It would seem the locals got used to Mr. Yarborough frequenting the town, buying bread from the baker, beef from the butcher, sugar from the grocers, and attending church every Sunday. But despite the offer of warm convivial hospitality that many of the generous locals extended graciously towards him, it would seem that Hugo Yarborough remained elusive, evasive, indifferent, as if caught up in a world of his own making. As Rachel's mother Evangeline had explained, "Why don't the locals stop putting the knife in the poor man? Stop taking offence when he says no to a barbecue invitation. Let the poor man breathe. He's a writer, for goodness sake. He needs to clear his mind of the clutter of everyday life, to open up the doors of inspirational creative ideas. Why doesn't anybody get that?" It was one day when Rachel and Elijah were walking down the country lane, when over across the embankment on the opposite side of the dirt road, standing on the edge of the forested woodgrove, who should they see but the silhouette of Mr. Hugo Yarborough. They could sense by his fixed demeanour, purposeful stride, along with the Winchester rifle he was carrying in his hands, that he was up to something curious, which ignited their attentions, sparking up their inquisitive curiosity. It was on a spontaneous, somewhat irrational, unfortuitous whim they decided to surreptitiously follow Mr. Yarborough through the hardwood forest made up of sugar maples, beeches, birches, red and white oak trees. It was an exquisitely idyllic summer's day, as prisms of sparkling, twinkling sunlight infused the forest with an ethereal, soft, gleaming light that danced through the boughs of the trees, casting pretty shadows on the viridescent ferns, along with the verdant wildbrush that grew wildly across the forest floor, along with some rather gnarled ropey roots that spiralled unevenly across the earthen surface that, although visually attractive to the eye, certainly had the potential to trip you off your feet so that you could easily lose your footing and take a very nasty fall. Birds trilled, warbled, whistled and tweeted in the trees as the two children cautiously followed Hugo into the heart of the woods. There were times he was bending down on his knees, thoroughly examining the ground, as though he was stalking something, following a trail of some kind. Once Hugo advanced past the dirty, muddy patch, the children quickly, stealthily ambled over to the area that he'd been examining moments before, that due to recent rain showers had become muddy, making the ground precariously slippery, another sure way to guarantee a nasty fall. Then Rachel and her brother gasped as they saw a huge footprint in the mud that was distinctly human-like, but it couldn't have been, measuring 18 inches. The two children placed their feet into the large print that made their feet look like they were wearing doll shoes. They were gobsmacked, thrown off guard, for they had not expected to see something as outlandish as this. "Oh, my God," said Elijah, who naturally knew a great deal about the natural world, even at such a young, tender age, as his father had taught him so much in his young life. "These footprints are fresh," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "If this is made by an erroneous mountain giant, that is, if those things are in fact real, then he or she is very close by." "You think so?" said Rachel, looking incredulous. They could see the figure of Hugh Yarborough ducking down behind some shrubbery, as if he was laying low for a moment, biding his time, waiting, listening, and clearly stalking something. Could he be stalking this thing that had made the massive footprint in the mud? It seemed more than likely. Rachel and Elijah moved through the trees with the stealthful, nimble proficiency and cunning agility of an accomplished mountain lion, so much so that Hugo Yarborough was none the wiser to their presence. In a trice the forest became very quiet, awkwardly still, and then a few tree branches began to shake and jiggle. And then suddenly, sauntering through the trees, standing only feet away from Hugo Yarborough, were two mountain giants, both male, who were clearly arguing about something. Rachel held her breath, hardly daring to breathe, while her heart pounded violently in her chest at 100 miles an hour. For never in her entire life, nor in her wildest dreams, had she anticipated such a bizarre sighting as this. If she were an adult, she might have thought she'd engaged in some moonshine, so her mind was deceiving her. But she knew she was as sober as the sunny day, neither intoxicated or delusional. Besides, one look at her brother's stupefied reaction told her that her eyes were not teasing her, for her brother's brown eyes had grown as wide as saucers, which affirmed to her that he too was seeing what she was perceiving. For indeed the legend of the mountain giants was no hoax. It was real. Was she afraid? No, she wasn't. She didn't feel any fear, for she didn't feel the heightened level of panic that you would expect from fear. Yet she should have been afraid, shouldn't she? I mean, these things were exceedingly intimidating, massive in size, easily over 10 foot tall, burly, powerful, majestic, lofty, utterly gargantuan, built like a farmer's tractor that would dwarf most animals. In her eyes they were exceedingly beautiful, magnificent, extraordinary, clearly apex predators, for she seriously doubted that a mountain lion would be a threat to a creature like this. The creatures were strikingly human, but built in man's image on a gigantic scale, although the skulls were more like a pyramid shape, and they were suspended low on the heavy shoulders. But the faces, oh my word, those faces, they were uncannily human. No doubt about it at all, with high cheekbones, deep-set dark eyes, square masculine jawlines, aquatic flat noses. All Rachel could feel was butterflies floating around in her stomach.
"Oh, my God," whispered Elijah to her. "They're beautiful. Angry, but beautiful." Rachel agreed wholeheartedly, while both remained steadfastly inconspicuous to avoid being detected. The two mountain giants were clearly male. They were having a real balmy, not unlike two pugnacious children. It was their juvenile behaviour that made Rachel assume that despite their gargantuan proportions, these creatures were still reasonably young. The two creatures stood facing each other, their elevated voices expressing a level of indignancy, as they chatted backwards and forwards in an audible language that Rachel had never heard before. There was a lot of finger-pointing. As much like humans, the creatures were clearly challenging each other. Imagine for a moment listening to two people in foreign language engaged in an altercation of some kind. You may not comprehend a single word they're saying, but based on the tone of their voice, with its raised resonances and barking snaps, you would be left in no doubt that they were clearly fighting. It was no different on this occasion. Rachel was left with a distinct impression that these two mountain giants were definitely brothers, possibly even twins, although she couldn't be sure. But they were having a huge disagreement. Although angry with each other, the altercation was not physical, which certainly suggested a level of emotional intelligence that was pretty impressive. Her perceptive, astute, diligent eyes glanced towards the hidden figure of Mr. Hugh Yarborough, who was cocking his rifle at the creatures, his fingers pulling back the lever to fire a shot. "No!" she screamed. "No, don't shoot!" She ran out of her hiding place towards Mr. Yarborough. "Don't shoot, Mr. Yarborough! Please, I beg you, don't shoot! Don't shoot!" The two creatures had stopped fighting. Their deep-set brown eyes were nonplussed as they focused on Rachel running through the undergrowth towards a strange man hankering low in the bushes. No one was more astonished than Mr. Yarborough, who stared at Rachel in horror. For a long moment he was lost for words. "Mr. Yarborough, you can't shoot those two mountain giants!" "I know what you're thinking, Mr. Yarborough. You think they're responsible for abducting your sister all those years ago." Mr. Yarborough looked astonished. "You know about that?" Rachel nodded. "I know about it all, Mr. Yarborough. That's why you came back to this town. You came to seek your revenge. You wanted to kill one of those giants in retaliation for your sister going missing. That would be morally reprehensible, Mr. Yarborough. That would be intrinsically wrong. Those creatures, they weren't even born when your sister was alive. They may be big, but they're very young." "But it was one of those mountain giants that abducted my sister. I know it! I know it!" "Really?" said Rachel, putting her hands on her hips defiantly, surprising herself by how like Evangeline, her mother, she sounded. "How do you know that, Mr. Yarborough? How could you possibly know that? My mother would describe that as hearsay. You have no tangible proof. It would never ever stand up in a court of law." "Footsteps were seen around the creek when my sister was abducted. Big footprints that could have only belonged to a mountain giant. And I have heard stories from indigenous people about girls being abducted by these beasts." "Mr. Yarborough, that could be a coincidence," piped my brother. "It doesn't mean that a mountain giant actually stole or even abducted your sister. I heard there was a gypsy wagon spotted near the site where your sister mysteriously disappeared. If you don't mind my saying, Mr. Yarborough, I believe you're barking up the wrong tree, as my dad would say." "You children are remarkably astute, very mature for one so young," said Mr. Yarborough, sighing in resignation, relaxing the rifle in his hands. "I concede you do argue a very profound case, but I still have to say I'm exceedingly doubtful." The two mountain giants had not flinched for a single moment, but stood still as statues, while Rachel continued to deliberate with Mr. Yarborough, and she was good, as she helped him to see how crazy his behaviour was. "Apart from anything else, Mr. Yarborough, if you shot one of those creatures, the other one would almost certainly kill you in seconds. I don't doubt that for a moment. It would be a natural reaction, and you couldn't blame them either. I would do the same if I was in their shoes and you killed my brother. I'd never let you get off scot-free. Never in a million years. These creatures are intelligent. Can't you see that?" Rachel turned around to face the two creatures, who for some extraordinary reason hadn't moved away. They appeared to be studying Rachel, her brother, and of course the strange man that was cowering behind the tree. She spoke to the mountain giants in audible English, almost as if she expected them to understand her every word.
I must apologise for Mr. Yarborough. You see, he's a very, very sad man." The creature's eyes were fixed on Rachel as she spoke. "He's sad because his sister was abducted over 20 long years ago from this very woods. He was going to shoot at you because, well, he thought a mountain giant had stolen his sister. He wanted revenge. Please don't be cross with him. He's not going to hurt you now." The most extraordinary thing happened. The two young mountain giants nodded at Rachel, gave Hugo a sombre glance. Then they turned around, gliding away, moving so gracefully it looked like they were floating. Rachel was convinced, as absurd as it sounds, that those two mountain giants comprehended her very words. "It's hard to explain," she'd said. "It was like they were telepathic. Certainly when they saw me thundering out of the bushes like that, they got the shock of their lives, but they were incredibly curious about the enigmatic situation, that they wanted to make sense of it somehow. One thing is for certain, I put a stop to that petty squabble of theirs. They were so benevolent, non-aggressive. I didn't feel remotely afraid." I'm glad to inform you that Hugo Yarborough had allowed two young kids to make him finally see sense, when he realised it was indeed irrational to lash out at a couple of benign mountain giants that had absolutely nothing to do with the abduction of his sister. Before long he ingratiated himself with the residents of the mountain town, beginning to accept invitations to barbecues and social engagements. The man, who at first seemed out of place, became a much-loved fixture and fitting in the small town, loved by many, while his detective novels were flying off the shelves, but his published name must be kept anonymous for the purposes of this story. One day, when Evangeline was 16 years old, there was a knock at the farmhouse door. Her mother, Evangeline, glanced at the kitchen clock. It was 7 o'clock at night. Who would be calling at this late hour, she wondered, scurrying off quickly to open the door. Who should be standing there in the doorway but Hugo Yarborough, along with a woman who looked extraordinarily like him, with a similar long face, a distinguished jawline, along with a long mane of blonde hair. "Sorry to pop around so late," he explained. "I'd like to see Rachel and Elijah, if I may." "Of course," said my mother. Elijah, come down, will you? Bring your sister with you. We've got guests. They want to see you." "Take a seat," said my mother, directing her guests into the living room, where they gratefully sat down on the upholstered chairs. For a second Rachel thought that maybe Hugo was about to introduce them to his new fiancée. "I'd like to introduce you to my sister Melissa, who went missing a long time ago." Evangeline gasped, while Rachel and Elijah stared in awe at the woman. "You're the missing girl? The one that went missing all those years ago?" The woman nodded. I don't understand," blubbered Rachel. "How's this even remotely possible? What happened to you? You disappeared into thin air. Nobody knew where you went." The woman smiled. "My name is Esmeralda Perron," she exclaimed. "I always believed, or rather should I say accepted, that I was a Roma gypsy, until my grandmother told me the truth, after my mother passed away unfortuitously last year. She told me that one day their caravan and horses were parked outside a well-known hiking trail. Apparently my mother took one look at the fair-haired little me running through the woodgrove and thought I was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen in her life. She said to her brother, 'I want that little girl to be my own.' And her brother, my uncle, went and abducted me. You see, my mother had been trying for years with her husband to have a baby, but it seemed she was infertile, so she raised me as her own, after which she subsequently did have 3 more daughters, so she wasn't sterile after all. Of course, I have no recollection of living a different life other than the one that I have led as a Roma gypsy, as I was abducted so young. Of course, I knew I was different to the rest of my family. I mean, that was clear. They all had deeply tanned skin, brown eyes, distinctive Eastern European looks, while I was blonde with blue eyes, so of course my parents literally lied to me. They told me they'd found me abandoned on the side of the road when I was very young. I believed that lie for a long time, falsely assuming that my parents didn't want me. I despised white people, loathed the fact that I looked like an American, not a Roma gypsy. One day my grandmother told me the truth. She felt I had the right to know where I came from. She did tell me that if I was to trace my real family, I mustn't give the rest of the gypsy clan away. Not to the law, that is, and of course I never will. You see, despite everything else, I still consider myself a Roma gypsy. I had an excellent childhood. I couldn't have asked for more loving parents. I would never want them to get into trouble, about what happened. Besides, I'm going back to my life in the wagon. It's all I've ever known. Anyway, I did my research, and I'm pleased to be reacquainted with my brother Hugo," she said, reaching out to squeeze his hand affectionately. "I am so, so glad we found each other. We will never, ever lose touch. Not now." "Which is why I came around at once," said Hugo, "to thank you both personally for speaking so much sense to me in the woods when I nearly killed those two innocent mountain giants a few years back. Imagine having that on my conscience now. I was sure the elusive mountain giants were responsible for my sister's abduction. But all the time you were absolutely right, Elijah. You perceived the gypsies abducted my sister. You were absolutely on to the money there." "Well, I never," said Evangeline, blotting the tears away from her eyes. "This is a turn-up for the books. What a remarkable story." The newspaper seemed to agree, as an article read, "Missing persons case finally solved from 1932. Little Melissa Yarborough has returned to her family safe and well, after having been abducted by Roma gypsies from a hiking trail during a family picnic when she disappeared over 25 years ago. The young woman, who calls herself Esmeralda, refuses to give details about her abductors, but has only come forward to connect with her blood relatives. Having been asked by the Beckley Herald how she felt about her abductors, she said, 'I love them with all my heart. I see myself as an authentic Roma gypsy, and I believe, despite everything, this was the life that God ordained for me. I have no regrets to what happened all those years ago, only hurt and anguish about what my biological family must have gone through as a result of my abduction. But I cannot apologize for how I feel, as I remain always a Roma gypsy in my heart.'" This was a story that was shared with me by my mother Rachel, who has long since passed away, along with the memories of this incredulous event, of which she shared with me when I was a young girl, describing it to me as the quintessential, most extraordinary experience of her entire young life. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the wind whistled through the blue spruce and Engelmann pine trees as the two boys entered the woodland area, where Great Uncle Joey would regularly go hunting for wild turkey with them. But on this specific occasion, Great Uncle Joey was nowhere to be seen, for the two exuberant boys were embarking on this marvellous adventure alone, before the sun had even basked its gloriously golden head over the valley to grace a brand new day. So let's just say they'd crept out while the dark, shady, inauspicious night was still projecting its sultry, oppressive course. Naturally, the two boys, both brothers at the time, Maxwell, who was 11, Miles, who was 12, who were from the city of Denver, Colorado, had been cordially invited to attend regular hunts with their uncle as a happy trio, but never once had Great Uncle Joey agreed to let them even pull the trigger or take down the feathery quarry for themselves. Why ever not? It was absolutely ridiculous. It wasn't as if they were not being supervised, for goodness sake. Yet Uncle Joey would lay down the law like a formidable headmaster, waggling his finger at them warningly. "I know it's disappointing, boys, but you're far too young to start shooting on your own. Good things come to he who waits. When you're older, you'll be able to hunt yourselves, but most certainly not now." Uncle Joe had strict, hard and fast rules about hunting. Maxwell secretly thought he wasn't the greatest hunter anyway, as he'd seen his Uncle Joey fire some dodgy shots that would have made a marksman blush, quake in his boots with a humiliating shame, if he was unfortunate enough to have to claim ownership to such hideously cloddish manoeuvres that lacked the nimble proficiency and prowess of a hardened professional. Of course, those derisive, contemptuous and somewhat pillorying thoughts concerning his uncle's obvious lack of hunting prowess were kept privately to himself, as there were some things you didn't share. This was one of them, when tact and sensitivity required dutiful employment. Great Uncle Joey was their grandmother's brother. He regularly invited the two kids to stay in his rustic off-grid mountain cabin, overlooking the Spanish Peaks, located southwest of Herfano County in Colorado, southeast of the city of Trinidad, at a 7,000-foot elevation, close to the Spanish Peaks wildlife area, where the two young boys often went elk hunting with their Uncle Joey, although of course it was always Uncle Joey that fired the quintessential lethal shot. It was 40 miles from the Boza de Osco State Wildlife Area, of over 30,000 acres of wilderness,
another prime location they would frequent regularly with their uncle for a spot of trout fishing. At least when it came to fishing, Great-Uncle Joey didn't cramp their style there. He'd allow them to cast out their own nets. You had to be grateful for small mercies, however small they may actually be. The two children were staying with Great-Uncle Joey and his wife Hazel for a couple of weeks, while their parents were abroad in Ireland visiting relatives on their father's side of the family, as many of his father's ancestors had immigrated to America during the potato famine in 1845, but there was still a remnant of their bloodline still living back in Ireland. It was during the dinner the previous night that Great-Uncle Joey had complained bitterly of some really tortuous stomach cramps that he had begun experiencing. Naturally, Maxwell was surprised, as the meal they'd just eaten was absolutely delicious. Unlike his mother's lousy, insipid, washed-out cooking, Aunt Hazel could literally prepare a feast for a king without even twitching her fingers. She was a natural cook. Maxwell knew that Great-Uncle Joey's adverse stomach condition was not a result of bad food or poisoning of any kind, because the melt-in-the-mouth cooked trout, along with the mashed potatoes they had just eaten, had been absolutely delicious. The boys both watched in horror as Great-Uncle Joey, who was a big man, all 6 foot 220 pounds of him, had holstered himself up from the table like a lumbering elephant, clutching the side of his stomach with his large hands, his face growing as white as paper, his brown eyes filled with terror.
"Hazel! Hazel!" he cried. "I think I might be dying. There's something terribly wrong with me. My stomach is cramping violently. I think you ought to call Dr. Anderson at once, before it's too late. My stomach feels as if it's about to explode in any minute. Maybe I've got appendicitis. Maybe I've got advanced bowel cancer. Maybe I have irritable bowel disease. Or maybe I've got one of those god-awful worms. What do you call them? Maybe I have a tapeworm crawling up in my guts, laying eggs in my stomach. Maybe they're about to hatch and wreak havoc on my bowels. Oh my God!" he said, his whole body quivering like a Portuguese man of war. "Oh my God! I think I can feel them wiggling, gnawing at my insides. The worms are everywhere. Or is it something else? I can't be sure. Whatever this is, he said, slowing down his voice for maximum impact. Whatever this is, it's definitely terminal." At these startling revelations, Maxwell and his brother glanced at each other with alarmed, disconcerted expressions upon their faces. This must be it, Maxwell thought to himself. Poor Uncle Joey is about to keel over and die. The horrifying, daunting possibility was like a sharp, painful stab in his guts. His face became downcast, his heart heavy, as he thought about how much less fun it would be without Uncle Joey around. All those exciting outdoor sanguine adventures they shared together would all be but a fleeting memory, a hazy blur on the horizon of their minds that would become fainter, vaguer, indeterminate, until it faded away into obscurity with the passing of time, until one day they became so bleached out that they would completely forget Uncle Joey altogether. Maxwell only had a brief recollection of his cat Arthur, who he had loved so much, but had been run over by a truck 2 years prior. He could barely remember the cat now. He was all but a distant, almost foggy cloud in his mind. Would it be the same if Uncle Joey were to pass away? He seriously hoped not, even though Uncle Joey could be exceedingly annoying, especially when they went hunting and were not allowed to shoot a damn thing. Even so, he knew he'd miss the man, warts and all. Both boys had been secretly appalled by their great-aunt Hazel's dismissive, almost indifferent, nonchalant behaviour towards Uncle Joey and his grievously serious condition. They could see for themselves that the poor man was clearly fading away before their very eyes, as the life was ebbing out of his body faster than water gushing down the kitchen sink. Anyone could see that from a mile away. Yet the impassive, apathetic, seemingly cavalier great-aunt Hazel, although acting as if she cared about Uncle Joey's plight, underneath it all she appeared to be playing some kind of insidious, callous charade, which made both boys feel quite nauseously disgusted. Did great-aunt Hazel want her husband to die, they wondered, Why wasn't she calling the emergency services out at once? Or failing that, at the very least, calling out Dr. Anderson? What on earth was wrong with her? Could she not see that her husband was withering away, like a wilting flower in the meadow? She was doing nothing about it at all. Had she lost leave of her senses, or did she have some other nefarious agenda? A vast inheritance blinking at her brightly in the future. A hefty life insurance policy, perhaps. Yet this was exceedingly unlikely, since the couple had never really had much money to rub together. But something strange was seriously up.
They had watched their aunt tenderly direct her husband towards his bedroom, a very Spartan, simplistic room at the furthest end of the cosy cabin, that pretty much just contained a large king-size bed, a chestnut bureau, along with 2 side tables with kerosene lamps. The cabin was made from quality timber beams that Great-Uncle Joey had erected himself 10 years earlier, when he and his wife had decided to retire into this part of the world and live off-grid, which they did with a flourishing, thriving success. They even had a composting toilet, which didn't smell at all, something that never failed to impress the 2 young boys. "Come this way, sweetheart," she'd said to Joey. "Just you wait and see. It's going to be absolutely all right. I promise you, you're going to be fine." The 2 boys stood in the doorway, watching Great Aunt Hazel pulling back the bed sheets, guiding her husband into bed, wrapping the sheets around him comfortably, while puffing up his pillows behind him, and mopping up his clammy forehead with a cool sponge. "There you are. Doesn't that feel so much better? Now, doesn't that feel better?"
"You must give Dr. Anderson a call now," cried Uncle Joey. "Hurry up! Hurry up!"
"I'll give him a call," she assured him dispassionately, swiftly leaving the bedroom, with Maxwell and his brother following behind her like 2 devoted toy poodles. To his immense bewilderment, his aunt didn't even bother to call the doctor. She simply returned to the bedroom with a glass in her hand, filled with a milky, cloudy-looking liquid. She seated herself on the edge of the cosy king-size bed, while her husband continued to groan.
Oh, it hurts, Hazel. It really hurts,"
he said, moaning. "Oh, I know, sweetheart. I imagine it does. Dr. Anderson will pop around shortly. But he's very sure, based on your symptoms, you've just got a spot of gastritis. Nothing very serious or life-threatening to worry about, he assures me. You just need some antacids and penicillin," she said, handing her husband a milky concoction. "Here, drink this, sweetheart. You're going to feel so much better. I can promise you of that." Great-Uncle Joey sat up to drink the liquid, quivering violently like a jelly, as he swallowed the bitter concoction, looking the picture of misery wrapped up in self-pity. "Is Uncle Joey dying, Aunt Hazel?" asked Maxwell, watching his uncle sit up, while cowering over in pain, clutching his stomach dramatically. He released some audible groans that would make the less well-informed think he was probably about to pop his clogs in any moment.
Oh!
"No," whispered Great Aunt Hazel. "No, Joey's not dying. He's just got a spot of gastritis, that's all. But I'll let you into a very big secret. Every time your great-uncle falls ill, he becomes like a helpless, pathetic baby. He's always 100% convinced he's about to die."
"But Aunt Hazel, he seems to be buckling over in pain. Shouldn't you call the doctor? I mean, you didn't really call the doctor, did you? But maybe this time he really is dying." "Sweetheart," said Great Aunt Hazel, gathering Maxwell generously in her arms, giving him a huge, affectionate, reassuring hug. "If your great-uncle really was dying, he wouldn't have the energy to put on such a fabulous performance, would he? He'd be too sick to even bother. If he was like that, I'd definitely call Dr. Anderson. But with him clutching his stomach, accentuating those groans with maximum impact, I know that he's absolutely fine. He's done this hundreds of times before. This is nothing new. It's just another performance of his. Even his own doctor knows him. He says your Uncle Joey is the biggest baby he's ever seen, who believes he's contracted every illness known to man." "Does he always do that, when he's sick?" asked Maxwell in astonishment. "I mean, make such a song and dance about it?" "Always," whispered Hazel. "I know my husband too well now. He loves to extract the maximum amount of sympathy when he's not well. He enjoys the attention and fuss, so I always humour him. Besides, he's always been a huge hypochondriac, falsely believes he's dying when he's quite well. A little graze on his knees, his knee is broken. A spot of blood, he's bleeding to death. A slight wheeze in the back of his throat. He's contracted lung cancer. Poor Dr. Anderson. He's had to give him hundreds of blood tests over the years just to appease your uncle, to reassure him that all is well, that he's not dying. No, he hasn't got cancer. No, he's not dying of tick-bite fever. And no, he hasn't contracted a deadly pneumonia. You see, your uncle will look at a medical dictionary, unlike the rest of us, but read all the symptoms, deciding that he has every single disease. He told me once he was absolutely amazed he hadn't died a long time ago, since he has the symptoms of a plethora of different illnesses listed in the medical dictionary. He would be looking it up right now, deciding what he's got, if I hadn't hidden it from him. Believe me, over the years he's informed me that his appendix is about to burst, that he's got Lyme's disease, blood poisoning, kidney disease. He needs dialysis. You have no idea, kids, what I've been through. Dr. Anderson says your uncle is the epitome of the 3 men in the boat story who worked themselves into a frothy frenzy, believing that they had almost all the diseases in the medical dictionary, so they assumed they were all naturally dying. The doctor wrote out a prescription for the 3 men. Do you know what the prescription was? No, said Maxwell. What was it? His aunt chuckled. It was 1 pound of beef steak, 1 pint of beer every 6 hours, a 10-mile walk every morning, in bed every evening by 11 sharp. And the last thing he wrote on the script was, don't go filling your heads with things you don't understand. They were amazed that the doctor's prescription worked. They felt a whole lot better, because they weren't sick at all. It had been blown up in their heads out of all proportion. Dr. Anderson does say you get a whole lot of hypochondriacs who do exactly the same thing, falsely diagnose their own conditions. But he says your Uncle Joey cuts the cake as far as being completely over the top in this regard. Maxwell could hear his uncle groaning again. Hazel! Hazel! I think I'm going to need some ginger ale to settle the stomach. The twinges. Oh, my God, the twinges. They're coming back. They're very, very nasty. You poor, poor thing, said Aunt Hazel, exaggerating her level of sympathy for Uncle Joey. She gave the kids a big wink as she rushed dutifully over to her husband's side to hold his hand in hers. She began to puff up his pillows all over again, which she had done only moments earlier. She took his temperature, straightened his bed, fulfilled the quintessential Florence Nightingale role, attending to her husband's needs. I'm so sorry, kids. I'm so sorry Uncle Joey is indisposed. Do you think you can keep yourselves entertained? Help yourselves to anything you fancy. Why not take a mountain bike ride down some of the open trails? Maxwell's account. It had been Miles' idea to get up at first light the following morning, with both our aunt and uncle conveniently indisposed, out of action, blissfully fast asleep in their beds. Let's go turkey hunting, he'd said. Uncle Joey will never ever know. We'll take his shotgun with us, the one he uses for shooting turkeys. We'll kill a whole turkey, show him that we're brilliant hunters. He'll see that even though we're young, we know exactly what we're doing. Besides, didn't Great Aunt Hazel say that we were free to entertain ourselves while Uncle Joey is sick, which means we can help ourselves to absolutely anything we want. And that includes the turkey shotgun. But what if we get into trouble for taking his shotgun? What then? I piped, feeling a rising level of unease. Well, if Uncle Joey throws a huge wobbly, we'll call his bluff. We'll say that Great Aunt Hazel told us to help ourselves to absolutely anything. And so we did. We took her at her word. We took the turkey shotgun. Now what's wrong with that? We'll act all innocent, look as if butter wouldn't melt in our mouths. It's called being resourceful with the truth. That's what it's called. Finally, my brother persuaded me against my own better judgment. He was always very persuasive, which was why, when he was older, he became a very successful attorney, winning cases for people, as his powers of persuasion, let's just say, have always been impressive. We quickly made some sandwiches, along with thermoses of hot chocolate, as well as leaving a note for my aunt saying, "Gone for a hike, to watch the sun rise. Not be gone for too long. Love, Miles and Maxwell. P.S. Hope Uncle Joey's feeling a lot better." And so it was at first light. Well, in truth, it wasn't light at all, as the world was marvellously swathed in a velvety darkness, with an ivory crescent moon breaking the severity of its bleak stronghold. Along with the clusters of silvery stars, we were able to make our escape from the wooden cabin, the squeaky rubber of our boots crunching the dewy turf beneath our cushioned soles. Thankfully, both armed with our light headgear, we were able to see our way clearly. I could feel the rise and fall of my chest as my heart began to thump. I was feeling exceedingly excited to be embracing the morning like this, bright and early. Perhaps it was the instinctive knowledge that Uncle Joey would not be terribly pleased with us, made the allure of this trip even more enticing. We were well used to getting up at this God-forsaken hour with Uncle Joey when going turkey hunting with him, but this morning it was exceedingly different for us. My brother and I were on a marvellous adventure together. Nothing could ever trump that. Ostensibly getting up at the crack of dawn was the best time to seamlessly blend into the environment unobserved by the indigenous wildlife, most especially the roosting turkeys, before the sun rose over the escarpment. We left the cabin moving with a proficient, skilled, nimble stealth that would have impressed even great Uncle Joey. We were dressed in our camouflage gear that our uncle had purchased for us. He told us that every part of our bodies needed to be well concealed, including our hands, as the wild turkeys, with their excellent eyesight, long-range peripheral vision, can spot you a mile away, or any sudden movement, so staying very still was a prerequisite for any self-respecting, successful turkey hunter. We'd also learnt the artful technique of calling from Uncle Joey, the precise staccato notes of the clucks and purrs and other more sophisticated sounds, all a masterful ruse to make a gobbler think that a hen is hankering around for him. It's a devious deception, I know, but if you get it right you can take down a sizable turkey quite easily. That, of course, is if you're lucky, but the birds are clever, very sharp, not easily outwitted. I had visions in my head of shooting an enormous turkey that would dwarf any turkey that great Uncle Joey had ever shot. I couldn't wait to see his flabbergasted expression when he saw that we were proficient hunters indeed, in our own right, that very definitely did not need to be chaperoned by an adult. The wind was blowing fiercely, whistling through the statuesque pyramid-shaped trees, causing them to bob their needled boughs as if dancing to music. Yet under the looming dark shadows they appeared foreboding, menacing, like sultry humanoid giants clustered together in insidious, uncongenial groups, for the ambience between them seemed hostile. We trudged through the Sylvan with our focus directed towards the upcoming turkey shoot, our hearts ever hopeful for success. But the good news is that if we did fail in our endeavours, Uncle Jody would be none the wiser, so we didn't have to feel the humiliation of a failed hunt. I was beginning to feel awkward in my environment, rather like a fish out of water, as it felt as if there were eyes everywhere watching us, but these eyes weren't warm, nor were they welcoming. They left you feeling distinctly uneasy, as prickles of dread spiralled down my spine. I was beginning to feel seriously creeped out. What on earth was wrong with me? I persuaded myself that of course the dark was intimidating. It always had been. As soon as the sun rose across the valley, I knew that my heightened level of angst would ultimately leave like the wispy smoke from a chimney. One thing I did observe, though, was everything seemed disturbingly quiet. So quiet, in fact, that you could have heard a pin drop, or in my case, I could hear my heart fluttering and my breathing intensify. It was exceedingly odd, I thought, that there were no crickets or frog sounds. But then the upcoming morning was on the threshold or door of a brand new day that would soon ultimately open up to reveal its full glory. But for a brief moment it waited in the wings, like the curtains at a theatre. Then quite suddenly the curtains would open. A light would flicker over the horizon, until the dark sky would become dappled, bespeckled and powdered in a golden glaze, while the night faded into obscurity like a foggy mist. So perhaps I thought the crickets and frogs had retired for the night. I mean, that would make perfect sense, surely. My brother broke the stiff, awkward silence with his sombre words that only elevated my level of trepidation. "Don't you feel as if something is watching us? I feel as if eyes are everywhere. Hundreds and hundreds of eyes, all watching us. It's giving me the heebie-jeebies." "You feel it too. I thought it was just me," I stammered. "Perhaps this was a crazy idea. Perhaps we should not have come. Perhaps we should go back." "Don't be silly, Maxwell. I didn't expect you to be such a wuss. We didn't come here to pussy out at the last minute like a pathetic pair of scaredy cats." "But you said yourself you feel as if we're being watched." "And I do. But I'm not about to be intimidated, am I? I'm no wuss." "Neither am I said. "Good then, let's keep moving. Let's move closer to the water at the creek. As the old hunter's adage goes, they love to roost where they can hear their droppings hit the water. Now look for any signs of turkey droppings." "Is that even true?" I asked. Of course it's true. But remember eyes and ears peeled. We also need to look for open areas, larger, more mature trees. As the turkeys avoid thick woods, it makes them feel insecure. Look here, I whispered to my bro. Look, there are turkey feathers here, lots of scat. This is the perfect spot for us to take cover. This is where they regularly frequent. We found a tree where a large hedgerow was growing between it, which we covered with a camouflage blanket that we'd brought along with us. We sat down on the earthen ground, waiting for the morning to grace us with her appearance. In the meantime we talked together in hushed voices, as I poured my brother a cup of hot chocolate from the thermos flask, while we tucked hungrily into our sandwiches. We'd certainly worked up an appetite. "Do you still feel unnerved?" my brother asked me. "Not any more," I said. "I feel a lot calmer. Good. I do too." We eagerly ate our ham and cheese sandwiches as the soft light of the early morning caressed the sky in a sweeping golden hue. The smoky greyness of the twilight receded. The morning finally broke. Then no sooner had her first impressions been made. The forest burst forth with cheerful chirps, tweets and trills of the dawn chorus. I could feel my heart rate visibly slow down, my breathing begin to relax. I smiled and even chuckled to myself secretly, chastising myself for being a big baby earlier on. I was so glad that I'd overcome my irrational, unfounded fears that had no basis on reality whatsoever. I mean, this was a perfect day. What could ever go wrong? My mother always used to say that whatever you fear barely ever comes into fruition. Of course, she was absolutely right. The sun was now filtering through the woodland canopy, its ethereal golden shafts gracing the earthen floor, with showers of twinkling light, so that it dappled the ferns in pretty shadows, while the water of the silvery creek literally twinkled, sparkled, glittered and gleamed. All of a sudden we heard a pounding sound. It was as if the earth between our feet was moving, as if a herd of bison was thundering towards us at an alarming, preposterous speed, as powerful hooves beat up, battered and hammered the earth. The noise was coming towards us. It was fast, efficient, speedy. Images of large, treacherous animals came flooding ungraciously into my mind, like a pugnacious, cantankerous elephant, or a disagreeable rhino. But then we weren't in Africa, were we? So what on earth was making this absurd, inexplicable rumbling noise? Nothing in this world, small or inconspicuous, could shake up the earth like this, make such a gargantuan commotion. In that moment I was locked in a stupefied fear, as if my vocal cords had been paralysed. There was a huge big fat ball trapped in the back of my throat. I could hear a small squeaky voice emanate from me, that I realised was mine. What's that? What's that? What in the heck is that? My brother's voice was sombre. It wobbled with uneasiness like a rickety, unstable, jiggling camping table that was about to collapse in any given moment. I don't know, he trembled, but whatever it is, it's big. As the transient sound neared its swift approach, the thunderous booming continued like a heavy drum. Boom, boom, boom. And then suddenly, as it had started, it then came to a sudden, pronounced stop. All was quiet for a moment, and for a second my brother and I drew breath again, as if assured that we were once again cushioned in safety. Whatever that grievous noise was, it wasn't coming our way any more. Well, so we hoped, with our fingers and toes secretly crossed. In a trice we heard the crunching of branches, saw the boughs of a large spruce tree jiggling precariously, while the whole tree shook violently. Then with a mighty snapping thrust, this tall tree came thrashing down with one almighty walloping crash, until it was lying flat upon the ground. That was when we saw him. There are no words in the entire universe that I can find adequately to describe what I was to discern, for standing with one monstrous foot strutted over a fallen tree was the most Herculean creature that I'd ever seen. It looked as horrifying as a demon from hell. I knew that he was looking directly at us, even though we were hiding behind the camouflage blanket. I was peeking through the hedgerow. I could see him clearly. I knew at once that this creature was a Bigfoot, for there is nothing else it could possibly have been, as it fit the stereotype profile of a Bigfoot to perfection. It was about 8 foot tall, covered in long black hair that literally gleamed. It was that shiny. The creature was built like a brick shithouse, No pun intended, for the creature was absolutely enormous. It boggles the mind that something that big can be so graceful, so agile, but this creature was all that, and much, much more. All I can say is that I doubt he could get through your front door without bending that pyramid-shaped head of his. But as for the creature resembling an ape, no, not really. Of course I get why people might say that, because of the long primate arms that hang well below the knees, that seem very similar to orangutan or a mountain gorilla. Also the distinctive shape of the head, not to mention the body swathed in long flowing hair. But really, if I am going to be brutally honest with you, I would say he was more like a human giant, covered in hair. The strength of this thing, well, he was powerful, as every part of his body rippled with dense muscle. And those legs of his, they were hell of a stocky. My brother put his fingers to his lips. "It'll be all right," he whispered. "He can't see us. Just keep perfectly still." Was my brother being serious, I wondered? Could he not feel the creature's eyes upon us? I trembled, my words wobbling, my confidence flagging like a punctured hot air balloon. "Bro, we need to go. We really need to go," I practically begged him. It was too late, far too late. We heard a thumping sound. The camouflage blanket was ripped forcefully from the hedgerow. I could hear the fabric tearing apart. Then staring directly at us with blazing, angry, tempestuous, deep-set eyes filled with an incandescent rage was a Bigfoot. I was right. He had sensed we were here all along. Perhaps he'd known for a long time. I watched him in horror as he curled back his lips, growing fiercer and fiercer like a pit bull. The hot-headed creature let out the most god-awful, ear-piercing roar that would easily cause glass to shatter. For a moment all was very still. Our knees trembled, crumbled, buckled beneath us. Our hearts, like the hands of a crotchety old clock, struggled to beat, while a hypothetical anaesthetist's needle deadened our instinctive response. For as try as we might to make our escape, we were frozen in terror to the spot. Our eyes filled with anguish as they locked into the eyes of this monstrous beast. I could hear him screaming in my mind, "Get out! Get out, or I will kill you! This is my place! Get out!" The tears began to trickle down my face like the raindrops on a window pane, as I tried desperately to manoeuvre my legs. My brother was screaming, "Run! Run! Run!" I cloddishly, clumsily managed to find my feet again. I started bolting through the woods as fast as I possibly could, while the Bigfoot remained hot on our trail, but he kept a distance. He began to throw rocks after us as we made our hasty escape. It was when my brother and I reached Great Uncle Joey's wooden cabin that we fell to the ground in a shattered, crumpled and dishevelled heap, far too exhausted to say a single word. We were like engines that had run out of fuel, or like an old rusty battery that was totally spent. We clutched the grass so tightly between our knuckles that we could actually see the white showing, our wide eyes staring into each other's with a transfixed open horror, for what seemed like an awful age. We said absolutely nothing, just lying on the grass, while the morning sunlight swept across our backs. It was my great-aunt Hazel who opened the front door of the cabin. She saw us prostrated in the grass. She wondered what was wrong with us. "What on earth is going on? Why do you look like you've been to hell and back?" "Because, Aunt Hazel, we have," I explained. She ushered us quickly into the kitchen, bustling around with a kettle on the gas hob. "You poor things! You both look as white as a sheet. What on earth happened?" "We saw a Bigfoot," I said. "A very angry Bigfoot." "You saw a Bigfoot?" said Aunt Hazel, repeating the words as if they were almost foreign to her. "You saw a Bigfoot?" All of a sudden the figure of Great Uncle Joey stood in the kitchen, hovering over us like an animated giraffe. "You saw a Bigfoot!" he said, his face breaking out into a wide open smile. "You saw a Bigfoot! Did you hear that, Hazel? They saw a Bigfoot! Where did you see it?" "Near where you take us turkey hunting." Great Uncle Joey began to run around the cabin frantically in a tearing rush, as if he had an urgent appointment to keep that he couldn't miss. He was throwing on his clothes frantically as fast as he possibly could, scrambling around for his video camera. "Sweetheart, aren't you feeling a little sick?" Hazel asked him. "Only moments ago you were—" Great Uncle Joey was trembling with excitement.
Imagine if I get the quintessential shot, the very shot that everybody's been waiting for, that unequivocally proves that Bigfoot is real. My footage will be up in lights on every YouTube channel. Imagine people will want to interview me all over America. I will be famous like the Patterson-Grimlin footage. Imagine, he said, his chest inflating, puffing up like an egotistical penguin. Don't go into the woods, Uncle Joey, I begged. Please, please don't. That Bigfoot is very aggressive. We took your shotgun in there, I'm afraid. It's out there in the woods. We can't go back for it. We're too afraid. Great Uncle Joey barely reacted to this astonishing revelation, as if it was water off a duck's back. He ignored our protests as we watched in horror. He started running towards the woods with a rifle and video camera clutched in his hands. He looked like a man dashing after a bus that he'd missed. There he goes, sighed Aunt Hazel, looking at us warily. Your great Uncle Joey is incorrigible. Did I not tell you the man was never sick? It was all in his head. Suffice to say, great Uncle Joey did return to the cabin a little while later, like a flagging, punctured beach ball that had lost its buoyancy. We didn't need to ask. It was clear he hadn't encountered the Bigfoot that we'd seen earlier. He had recovered the turkey shotgun, using this fortunate discovery as the quintessential excuse to lay into us for being impertinent young boys to have the brass-neck nerve to ever consider hunting a turkey without adult supervision. I told you, you cannot go shooting turkey on your own until you're old enough. We apologised to him profusely, but the following day we went turkey hunting with Uncle Joey, who I suspect was still sneakily keeping his eyes pinned for a sighting of a Bigfoot, as he'd sneakily brought his video camera along, something he never normally did, and he also insisted that the video kept rolling the whole time. Surprisingly, we weren't afraid to go into the woods again, as Uncle Joey's irrational enthusiasm had somehow rubbed off on us in regards to the Bigfoot that we'd encountered the previous day, which made us think that perhaps he never was planning to hurt us at all, but was just being rather territorial. I'm delighted to inform you that on the hunt we took down a large gobbler, but as for the big hairy humanoid known as Bigfoot, we regretfully never saw him again. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was a warm, pleasant day in Seattle, Washington. Not too hot, not too cold. The temperature was pleasingly pleasant, perfect for a spot of shopping. The tall, sultry oak trees that fringed the pavements of the street swayed their boughs gently in the wind, while their leaves rustled. I had one thing on my mind, and one thing only, and that was to buy my little 3-year-old niece a pretty little princess dress for her up-and-coming 4th birthday party. I knew exactly where to buy it, as there was a perfect cute little boutique kiddie shop in Seattle called the Little Princess that sold these fabulous princess outfits with the wide, ethereal but stiff silk ballerinic frills that projected horizontally from the waist, attached to a glittering bodice of silvery rhinestones, sequins and French diamante that made every little girl look like the quintessential princess. "It's so beautiful," said the shop assistant, "and so painstakingly made by hand. So every single one of these dresses is a unique work of art in its own right." She said this, folding the pretty pink dress into layers of pink tissue paper, smiling at me enthusiastically. "You know I never get tired of selling pretty princess dresses like this to children. Your niece is going to love this one. I do adore the clusters of material flowers above the tutu skirt." I nodded. "She is going to love it. My little niece always fancies herself as a princess." The effusive, rather gregarious shop assistant, who I was to later learn was in fact the owner, proceeded to wrap up a flowering, sparkling, twinkling and shimmering crown, or tiara if you like, that was made of realistic-looking pretty pink and white flowers, interspersed with glittering rhinestones that complemented the dress superbly, as every princess needs an illustrious crown. This one was unique, personalised, marvellously special. My niece was absolutely going to love it. All of a sudden the glass door of the boutique swung open violently, causing the door to creak, the inside bell to jingle. A stranger came bolting into the store, bringing in with him a fear that travelled on the wind like an invisible smoke, so that the whole shop was clouded, enveloped in such an oppressive energy that you could tangibly feel it, rather like a pungent, offensive perfume that makes you want to hurl.
Believe me, fear has a smell or essence all of its own. A bitter, stinky, sour, rank, sweaty, nauseatingly sweet smell that clings to the air with a vinegary, biting, acidic, claustrophobic bouquet. The young man was in his early 20s with a crop of full blonde hair, a slightly spotty chin, a pair of pale blue eyes that were filled with a foreboding dread. He screamed, "They're going to kill me! Call the police! Call the police!" Two intemperate, hot-headed, homicidal thugs bolted into the shop, one grabbing the man forcefully by the chest, throwing, plunging, crashing him to the ground into a kneeling position, while the other one was waving the revolver around in his hands precariously. "Get down!" he said to me and the shop assistant in a demanding, no-nonsense voice. "Get down onto the floor, both of you, on your knees with your hands above your heads, or I will blow your heads off. Get that? I'll bloody kill the both of you." Fear coursed through my veins, while my heart pounded violently in my chest. My body was physically shaking, wobbling, and jiggling like a mould of jello. "Please, please," I begged, my eyes filling with tears, pouring down my face in floods like raindrops on a glass window pane. "Please don't kill me. Please, please don't kill me." "Take anything you want," cried the shop assistant. "Anything, absolutely anything you want." She was now crouched on her knees, her body trembling in trepidation, while her eyes were so filled with an undisguised horror. "There's lots of money in the till. Please take it. Take anything. As I said, anything you want. But please, please don't hurt us." The man that was cowering down on the carpeted floor was now drenched in his own sweat. His white T-shirt clung to his body like a limp rag. He was lying in a clenched heap, his hands covering his head. He looked as if he was in a Muslim temple, bowing prostrate. In what seemed like a second, he was kicked violently by one of the thugs with his heavy steel-rimmed boots, with no mercy spared, as those kicks were crushingly brutal, very vicious, like someone intent on squashing a roach to death, while the cold metal of a revolver was now cocked at his head. The boy began to squirm and scream out in pain. "Any last words, Josh, before I pull this trigger?" The young man was ashen, his skin as white as a sheet. The sweat was pouring down his face. He looked at the men with pleading, begging, desperate eyes. I told you I will get you the money. I promise I will get you it. I'll pay you back." "Like hell you will. You know the rules around here. You broke the code of ethics. It's a bullet on the side of the head. You were warned about this before you got involved with us. We always warn everyone." "There's no need to kill him," came the brave, stoic voice of the shop assistant. "How much money does he owe you? I'll pay you." $20,000, woman. That's how much he owes us." I can get you the money," said the woman. But please don't kill him. You can't kill him. Please don't kill him. I beg you. I can get you the money." "Shut up, woman. This isn't your bloody business. This is personal. It's not always about money. It's about loyalty, honour, obedience. It has nothing to do with you. But it will if you don't shut your bloody mouth up right now, woman." Then it happened. The man pulled back the trigger. Boom. The young man fell back onto the carpet with a mighty thud. His dead fish-like eyes glazed as they stared vacantly into space. Only a second ago he was breathing, but now he was an empty shell, a vessel. The essence of who he once was, vaporized like the mist on your truck window once the heater is engaged. My body heaved, jolted, jumped in reaction to the shrill ear-piercing popping sound of the bullet, as if I myself had been shot, for it was as if the whole floor that I was kneeling on had become wobbly, unsteady, rickety, like a fisherman's boat on a tempestuous sea. I realized that this was because my whole body was a gibbering, gelatinous mess. For a moment the illustrious Princess Boutique seemed to shudder, palpitate, quiver, quake, as the carpeted floors absorbed the shock of this horrifying horror that was now indelibly printed on the fabric of time, that, although no longer visible, hung there like a silken fibre from a spider's web, never ever to be forgotten, for the lifeblood of this man was in this place. Then all was very still. You could have heard a pin drop, as both men scuttled to their feet, running out of the shop fast, down the street at the speed of light, to make quick their escape. I wish I could say that me and the shop assistant reacted with a savvy speed and efficiency by calling the police at once. I regret we did not, for shock incapacitated us, holding us hostage in a suspended state of disbelief. It was as if what had transpired was really only an insidious nightmare from which we would surely wake. We were only jolted out of our wobbly state when a woman entered the boutique, the doorbell jingling as she pushed it open. She stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes growing wide with horror, as she let out a discomposing scream, running out of the boutique screaming, "Someone's been shot! Someone's been shot!" It was her scream on seeing the dead corpse lying on the floor with the blood trailing on the carpet that jolted us out of our delirium. "Someone's been shot! Someone's been shot in my shop!" said the shop assistant, wobbling nervously as she clutched the phone in her hands, speaking to the emergency services. "Someone's been shot! Yes, at the Little Princess boutique. We need the police right now." Of course, the police were invariably called, and me and the shop assistant were escorted to the station to answer a host of questions, to look at mugshots of well-known criminals, and we even sat in for a police artist to draw the young men we'd both seen, who the police were certain were involved in a notorious drug cartel with a repugnant reputation for killing any wayward dealers. So harrowing, tortuous and distressing was this experience for me personally that it rattled my life to such an extent that I was never the same again. It was as if the whole chilling experience was replaying itself in my mind over and over and over again, on rewind, rather like a roller coaster that just would not abate. At the time I was living outside Seattle, in a large Georgian house that had been subdivided into 3 separate residential homes that on the outside looked like one substantial grandiose mansion, only you could see the 3 separate pathways that led directly to 3 separate front doors, all painted in distinguished different colours to procure our identity, and of course to ascertain each house one from the other, so that visitors to my home knew that mine was the one front door that was painted in a navy blue colour. The very ornate white property overlooked a large sprawling open graveyard, with tombstones so old some were literally covered in algae and lichen, that was flanked in the furthest distance by a towering woodgrove made up of Douglas firs and ponderosa pines. Ever since the gut-wrenching violent ordeal at the fairy-tale-like Princess Boutique, it was no surprise that the cute little expression of a little girl's dream had now closed its doors, as the shock of the incident meant that even the owner of this whimsical, wistful enterprise could not stomach her job any more, as memories of the incident hung like a sticky spiderweb over her life, clouding her aspirations in an oppressive darkness, and try as she might, she could not get rid of those silken fibres that stuck to her visionary hopes and dreams for the place like nasty bits of tacky chewing gum that you could not shift. Ostensibly, the traumatizing memories, along with the haunting flashbacks, tore into the fabric of her soul, much as it had done for me. I had resigned from my job as a local school teacher at school. I was receiving trauma counselling at home, but I had reached a stage where I couldn't leave my own premises. I was compounded by such an excruciating, tormenting terror that had made me become a prisoner in my own home. If I did try to leave my house, I was gripped by such an insufferable terror, so much so that I would break out into a cold sweat, followed by panic attacks that were so extreme that on one occasion an ambulance was called. I thought I was dying of a heart attack. I was now having my groceries delivered to my own home, living like a hermit or a princess locked away in an ivory tower. "One step at a time," the counsellor had assured me. "Trauma affects us all very differently. But I assure you, slowly and surely we will get there. You're suffering from agoraphobia, which is perfectly understandable in the circumstances. You've had a nasty, nasty shock. But in time you'll be as right as rain and go back to reassuming your normal life." For me, the idea of my life ever resuming any sort of normality seemed a long way in the future. "But what if that never happens?" I'd said. "What if I spend the rest of my life cooped up in this house, too afraid to ever leave?" "I'm sure it won't come to that," the counsellor had assured me. But I doubted he was right. I felt certain that never again would I have the courage to leave my front door. Of course, my parents, along with my sister and my little niece, visited me regularly, repeating like a parrot exactly what the therapist had told me 100 times before. Little steps. Slowly and surely you'll get back to living a normal life, they would say. But I could tell by the worried secret glances on their faces that their words did not convey what they really thought. And so it was I would sit on the second floor of my home in the bedroom, with my window facing the graveyard, on a rocking chair, like a withering, frail old lady. I was young then, in my late 20s at the time, with the world as my oyster, but it certainly didn't feel like that. With my binoculars I would watch the comings and goings on our street, and of course the graveyard across the road, often frequented by curious people who were naturally drawn to the unnamed graves with an undisguised fascination. I don't know what it is about graveyards, but they seem to provoke a macabre interest. I suppose watching the comings and goings of the outside world was my one connection to it, which was why I became pretty much transfixed to whiling away the long lonely hours of my uninspiring drab life, just watching people. Granted, I got entertainment from television videos and the internet alike, but they all seemed far removed from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. I could see Mrs. Jeffreys walking her little dog through the gravestones. Her dog would lift up his leg on a tomb to pee against it, or decided to deliver a coiled, smelly package on some nearby turf. Mrs. Jeffreys would glance around furtively to see if anyone had seen her dog's offence, of which she could have attended to easily, as her pocket was well equipped with some dog waste removal bags, but having decided that they hadn't been seen, she would hastily waddle off with her dog, as if nothing had ever happened. It seemed getting away with doing something was exceedingly gratifying for her. Then there was my neighbour's 3 boys, who lived next door to me behind the yellow front door, all between the ages of 13 and 15, who enjoyed kicking a ball in the graveyard. On this occasion I watched them having the time of their lives, as there were lots of areas between the stones to kick a ball. I could see a pugnacious man with a bald, shiny head draw up his truck to the side of the road, where he trudged towards the boys with a purposeful, angry stride, pointing accusatory fingers at them, oscillating his arms wildly with his mouth going up and down, while the expression on his face appeared inflamed with anger. I could always fill in the blanks, imagine what he was saying. "You bloody kids! What are you doing kicking a ball around a graveyard like this? Have you got no respect for the dead?" This wasn't the first time an altercation like this had happened, so I knew those kids would be back to fight yet another day, seemingly unhindered by the constant telling off of passing strangers that was frankly not much of a deterrent at all. I watched them hang their heads in shame dutifully, while the eldest boy appeared to be apologising profusely. "Sorry, sir," I imagine he was saying. "I promise you, we won't do it again." But as he said this, his fingers were crossed behind his back. The stranger, definitely suspicious, watched the children with a huge scowl on his face as they scurried hastily across the road to the pavement and grassy verge that framed our side of the road. The shortest one, whom I imagine was the youngest, was clutching the ball tightly in his hands. With their faces now facing away from the disagreeable man, they were laughing. I watched the man get in his truck and drive off. One night I was awoken to a banging sound. I could hear some clattering going on in the neighbour's kitchen. I was downstairs at the time, having fallen asleep in front of the television. The dividing wall between my neighbour's kitchen and the living area was so superfine it was easy to overhear conversations, especially since the whole family next door perpetually spoke with raised voices. I glanced towards my living room clock. It was midnight. My sliding door that led out into the front yard had block-out curtains that clearly needed drawing, but the distracting, raised, belligerent voices in the neighbour's kitchen sharpened my attention. I was immensely curious to find out what was going on, and like a snooping, nosy neighbour who hasn't got anything better to do with their time, I scurried towards the wall to have a really good listen in to a conversation clearly not designed for my ears to hear. In truth, I was always hungry for entertainment. I had an insatiable desire and secret hankering for excitement in my life, as being a prisoner in my own home meant life could get tediously boring for me. I pressed my ears against the wall, listening in to the conversation. "You stupid bloody idiot!" I could hear a young male voice say. "It's a good job Mum and Dad are out. If they knew you used his rifle, you'd be in real shit. You silly idiot! How could you do that? You weren't meant to use it unless we had to." We were just following him into the woods, but no, you couldn't hold it together, could you, bro? You're the oldest. Why did you insist on shooting him? He was running away from us, not to us, you idiot. You shot at him in cold blood. It's disgusting. What if he comes after us? He might have seen where we live. Did you even stop to think of the ramifications of shooting him? It could come back to bite us, but no, you didn't think, did you, bro? You just reacted like you always do, without engaging your brain. Don't be silly. He won't come after us. Why would he do that? You saw him. He ran into the woods. He's gone. He's frightened. He'll leave us alone. Yes, but he's badly injured. You hurt him, bro. Your bullet went right through the side of his chest. He bolted away. But what if there are others like him out there? You heard that other scream. Where did that come from? It could have been another member of his family out there. If they've seen where we live, heaven help us, bro. That's all I can say. I should have been the one carrying the rifle. I knew I should. You may be older than me, but by golly, I'm the one with the brains around here. They could hurt us. They could seek revenge. Maybe they're watching us from the trees. Oh, stop being so dramatic. We'll stay away from the graveyard for a while. Let the dust settle. In case he's around, that is. I'm sure it'll be fine.
You don't think he's going to die? Came a little subdued voice, which I imagine came from the youngest boy.
It'll be a good thing if he does die. If he sees us again, he might recognise us. There's no telling what he'll do. No one must say a word about this to Mum or Dad. If Dad knew I used his rifle, I'll be grounded.
Won't he be able to tell if you've used it? Came the little voice again. Can't you tell if a rifle's been used? I heard you can. What about the used ammo?
Of course not, silly. Dad doesn't know we know where he keeps the key to his rifle cabinet, does he? If he discovers something untowards in regard to his rifle, he won't suspect a thing, because we don't know where he keeps the key. If he asks us, we act as if he's completely bonkers. I'm sure he's going to put it down to him being a little absent-minded. He won't suspect a thing, I know he won't. The main thing is we have to keep our lips sealed. They'll be back in the morning, so don't go giving away anything. No hangdog guilty expressions on your faces, or Mum will think we're up to something. Now let's go to bed. Forget this ever happened.
But you're sure this thing won't come back to haunt us?
Of course not, came the reassuring voice that sounded rather too wobbly to me, as if the person wasn't confident at all in what they were saying, but were trying to convince their flagging doubts. Naturally, I was absolutely stunned. I mean, had these 3 children actually shot a man in the woods? Why would they do such a crazy thing? I didn't know how to react. Now I was wide awake. I decided to backtrack on the video that I'd been watching, return to the point before I'd fallen asleep. My body was covered in a long duvet on the sofa, my bent legs crushed against my chest as I dived into a bowl of salted caramel popcorn, swigging down a cold glass of Mountain Dew, which I placed on the coffee table before me. Before long, I got caught up in the gripping, compelling drama where 2 men with black stockings on their faces were creeping cautiously into a house through a sliding door much like my own. My heart began to thump in my chest. Why on earth was I watching something that only provoked my worst fears? Wasn't this supposed to be a comedy? But in my book this was nothing funny. Nothing was funny about this at all. I could feel my angst intensify, reminding myself that I hadn't drawn the block-out curtains of my sliding door. I moved surreptitiously towards the windows, my nerves frazzled by a rising level of trepidation that the movie had clearly evoked in me. I stopped dead in my tracks. My body froze like an ice statue. As staring at me through my own glass windows were 2 huge human-like faces from 7 feet off the ground, of 2 monstrous giants covered in lots and lots of hair. Of course I couldn't see them clearly, but their faces were pressed against the window pane, looking directly at me. I could see an ominous, thick, sausage-sized finger fingering the corner of my slightly ajar sliding door, pushing it back until it finally opened. A burst of cold breeze entered the room, followed by 2 powerfully intimidating creatures that were so dauntingly big they would make a refrigerator seem small. At first it seemed like a joke, as if 2 men in gorilla suits had entered my living room and were playing some kind of bizarre, twisted, nonsensical joke on me. But my eyes could see clearly that this wasn't a practical joke of any kind. These creatures were absolutely real. I could see willowy smoke emerging from the aquatic nostrils of the larger creature, who looked less than amused. Her grey leathery face wore an expression of incandescent rage. All at once I knew what these creatures were. The revelation hit me like a ton of bricks. They were Bigfoots. I had 2 Bigfoots in my living room whose eyes were focused directly on me. This was some kind of ridiculous and exceedingly bizarre event. The larger Bigfoot was female, easily over 8 foot tall, 3 foot wide across the shoulder area, 700 pounds easily. The Bigfoot who was standing next to her was whimpering like a child, and although big, he was lanky, lean, muscular, at about 7 foot tall. He was unequivocally still a youngling. I could see a big patch of congealed blood on the side of his muscular, dense chest that appeared almost bulletproof. He was holding it down with his hand. It was clear he was in pain, but I did not perceive that any lasting damage had actually been done, because the creature was in good shape. I then realised that this was the creature the next-door neighbour's kid had shot with his father's rifle. It seemed that the female, who was his mother, had come to extract her revenge upon the boy. The trouble was, she had come to the far end of the house, which was my section of the old mansion. The Bigfoot had got the right house, but the wrong section of the house. She had chosen the blue front door instead of the yellow one, which was where the 3 boys lived. The huge female creature looked at me through her treacle-coloured, wide, deep-set eyes, pointing directly at her youngling's wound and showing me the blood, as if to say, "Look what you've done! You've hurt my son!" She moved towards my settee, thrashing it across the ground so hard that the underlying wooden scaffolding and upholstery just broke, like a brittle bar of peanut brittle snapping in half. She was about to lunge towards another piece of my furniture to tear it apart, when the whimpering Bigfoot started chattering to its mother in a very articulate language. It was shaking its head profusely, as if to say, "It's not her, Mum, it's not her. She isn't the one that hurt me." I watched the mother's face visibly soften. Her animosity towards me slowly waned, faded, subsided, relaxed. She looked almost apologetic, but continued to point to her son's wound, as if to say, "Can you see why I'm angry? Someone did this to my son." I nodded. "I'm sorry," I said, speaking audibly in English, hoping that in some way she might understand me. "You must be very upset. Very, very upset, but believe me, it was all an accident. I'm sure the person who shot your boy didn't actually mean to do it." The female Bigfoot was studying me. She was looking at me directly in the eyes. I swear to you she could read my mind. I knew she could. It was like she was reading me like a book. I am 1000% sure these creatures are telepathic, so you have got to guard your thoughts in their presence. "If you forgive me for saying so," I continued, "but it's easy to be scared by your kind. You're awfully big. I can understand why it happened. People do silly things when they're scared." The Bigfoot looked at me again through her dark eyes, as if assimilating my words. I beckoned for the 2 creatures to follow me. At first they were hesitant, but then they reluctantly obliged, and I led them into my kitchen, indicating for the little one, or the youngling, to sit on my kitchen chair, while I began to clean up the wound with some disinfectant. The water in the sink became saturated with blood, but I could see the wound was already healing. It was a very superficial wound. The mind boggles at how tough and robust these creatures actually are. He was a lucky Bigfoot, for it was clear he would live to fight another day. I was very fortunate that my Uncle Pedro was a practicing trauma surgeon in Seattle, so I knew a thing or two about bullet wounds. I fidgeted around with my sterilized finger underneath the skin to find myself touching something cold and hard in the narrow cavity of the open gash. It was the bullet. I could hardly believe it. I pulled it out, hardly daring to believe that so little damage had been done, and that the bullet hadn't even gone through the body, as you would have expected, which was rather weird. But then the Bigfoot's body was so dense with muscle. I heard of a woman once with a gunshot wound that was lodged in her breast implant, and the implant saved her life, as the bullet became wedged in the gel. In this case, the muscle density of the creature's body had saved his life. I marvelled at the wound, that it was so superficial. In truth, this very same bullet could have killed a human in a heartbeat, but to this creature it was merely a graze, but a graze that hurt him a lot. I washed the bullet under the warm water tap. The water tap going on and off was a source of great fascination for both Bigfoots, who kept turning it on and off themselves with looks of unrestrained astonishment on their faces. The ambience in the kitchen was warm, cosy, congenial, and any previous hostility the female creature may have felt for me had long since dissipated like the steam from a kettle. I handed the wash bullet over to the little creature, who examined it with awe. The expression on his face was one that was absolutely thrilled. He was over the moon. He handed the bullet over to his mother, who studied the object curiously, rolling it around in her sausage-sized fingers, but the little creature snapped it away from her, as if to say, "No, it's mine. I want it." He rolled it around in his hands, looking as pleased as Punch with his newly acquired strange possession, while the female Bigfoot looked slightly disheartened and deflated that she had nothing of her own to treasure. So I immediately made amends by handing her the sizable rose quartz stone that I had balancing on the window ledge, a present recently given to me by my sister, who believed that after the horrifying shooting at the Princess Boutique that I had experienced, that the rose quartz would ward off negative emotions, replacing them with positive ones. "It'll bring you balance in your life," she assured me. I'd seen the female Bigfoot eyeing the rose quartz earlier on as she had entered the kitchen, much like a magpie who admired a glittering jewel. I handed it to her, placing the stone in her hands while looking at her directly in the eyes. "This is to say sorry for what those boys did to your boy," I told her. She grabbed the quartz, rolling it around in her hands, unable to disguise the look of rapturous glee on her face, as she let out an excited whoop! Whoop! Her eyes shining with an ecstatic appreciation, an enthusiasm and joy that I have yet to see in a human being. I mean, this Bigfoot mama was absolutely over the moon with my gift. I then bustled around in the kitchen to make the Bigfoot's peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, which they ate with jubilant gusto. The female creature looked at me, nudged my shoulder, giving it a tight squeeze, as if to say thanks. And then I watched the two of them gliding away so gracefully under the light of the moon and the gentle infusion of the street lights. They darted through the gravestones towards the wooded area that flanked the cemetery. I was so sad to see them go, because in truth I've never ever entertained such exciting guests before. I felt a true connection with the female Bigfoot. I knew that the boys next door would sleep peacefully in their beds that night, as those two Bigfoots would not be coming back to extract their revenge. The next morning I woke up a new woman, surprised to discover that the fear that had imprisoned me for so long appeared to have vanished. The idea of leaving my front door, walking outside, no longer seemed so daunting. It was as if my encounter with the two Bigfoots had knocked me out of my fear. I was certain my agoraphobia had completely gone, melted away like the butter on a blueberry pancake. How had that happened? I couldn't even fathom. I smiled as I thought about the two Bigfoots that I'd encountered in the early hours of the morning. I thought about them. They'd been so human, so incredibly emotionally intelligent. Nothing like the Bigfoots I'd heard described on television before. They were always described as ape-like humanoids, predisposed to being aggressive. Perhaps, I thought to myself, they are misunderstood. It was that afternoon that I opened the front door of my home for the first time in 2 years, walking towards the neighbour's bright yellow door. I knew the boys would be at home by now from school, while their parents were working in Seattle. The youngest boy, called Declan, opened the door to me. He looked up at me in surprise. "Aren't you the lady who lives next door? The lady who's too scared to leave her house?" he asked. "The very same," I said, thinking how fast news travelled, as everyone clearly knew about the crazy lady who locked herself away in her home like a princess in her ivory castle. "But you're not scared any more, are you? 'Cause you wouldn't be here otherwise, would you?" "No," I said, "I'm not scared any more." The boy was staring at me through the door as though observing an anomalous creature at the zoo that he couldn't quite figure out. "Do you mind if I come in?" I asked. "I'd like to speak to you and your brothers, if I may." The boy shrugged his shoulders in a nonchalant way. "Sure," he said, opening the door, letting me into the house. I was guided into the kitchen with its paper-thin wall, from which I had gleaned many a conversation. The two older boys were in the kitchen, buttering bread and piling it high with sliced turkey, cheese and tomatoes. They looked up in surprise to see me. "This is my older brother, Caden," he said, pointing to the older boy, "and this is Zachary. This is the lady from next door who's too scared to leave her house, remember?" The boys looked at me with an intrigued interest. "Want a sandwich, miss?" Caden asked me. "It's really no trouble. We've got lots of turkey and cheese going spare." "No thanks, I've already eaten." "Suit yourself," said Caden, beckoning for me to take a seat at the breakfast nook that looked like a collector's eclectic piece from the 1970s, where all three brothers, with plates decked out with sandwiches, slid next to each other, taking seats on the opposite side of the nook facing me. "What is this all about, ma'am?" asked Caden, taking a large bite of his sandwich. "It's about what happened last night." At this all three boys froze like wax statues at Madame Tussauds, their eyes pinned on me. "I know all about the Bigfoot you shot." Caden almost choked on his sandwich. "It was an accident. I got scared. I didn't mean to do it." "He didn't mean to do it. Miss, he didn't mean to do it, Declan insisted. It was an accident. The name's Paisley, I said. Paisley Skylark, but you can call me Paisley. How do you know about this, Miss Paisley? Asked Caden, looking rather astonished. You won't tell my father, will you? He'll kill me if he knew I'd used his rifle. He's right. Dad can be awfully mean when dealing out punishments. He bears a grudge for a very long time. He's slow to forgive, said Zachary. I shan't be telling anybody anything. But how do you know about this? Asked Caden. How could you possibly know? The kitchen wall. It's paper thin. I can hear everything. Last night the two Bigfoot pulled back the sliding doors of my own living room when I was watching television. The large female Bigfoot completely obliterated my expensive couch. She was after you, Caden. I imagine since you shot the Bigfoot in the chest, who was clearly her youngling, she was furious about what you'd done. You mean the Bigfoot came back for revenge after I shot it? Something like that, I said. But they didn't attack you, did they? Said Caden. I mean, you're absolutely fine. I nodded. I'm fine. So are they. The Bigfoot you hit was very young, but he's going to be absolutely fine. Make a full recovery. I cleaned up the wound of his, removed the bullet. It didn't go through him. They have solid bodies that seem to heal fast, so he's going to be absolutely fine. Lady, said Caden, looking at me in astonishment, let me get this right, 'cause it ain't making any sense to me at all. You're too scared to leave the premises of your own home, but you're not scared to clean up the wound of the most intimidating creature that I've ever seen. That makes you a hell of a brave. Not really. You see, behind all that hair and their very big size, they're not much different to you and me, really. They're emotionally intelligent, which means they respond to reason, which is why I think you can rest assured you can still kick your soccer ball around the gravestones. I think the female Bigfoot understood what I was saying. I apologized to her on your behalf, saying that I didn't believe you meant it. I think I got through to her, I really do. I do believe she understood. I also believe she accepted my apology on your behalf. You know about our ball games? Well, you could say that shut away in my ivory castle, I tend to see a lot. Why did you shoot the creature, Caden? What on earth happened? Why were you even carrying your father's rifle at the time? What on earth possessed you to shoot at the creature? Well, it was last Tuesday. We were playing ball in the graveyard, said Caden. I noticed a Bigfoot watching us playing ball together. Once it knew it had been observed, it quickly scurried away. It seemed curious, interested in our game, longing to take a part. I was excited, enthralled by what I'd seen. I told my brothers, but they were sceptical and dismissive. I suspected some Bigfoot may be hanging out in the woods, otherwise I wouldn't have encountered one spying on me like that behind a large spruce tree. I persuaded my brothers to sneak in the woods during the night with me, when my parents were away last night for the entire evening. We knew it was wise to take my father's rifle with us, just as a precautionary measure. I had no intention of using it. I suppose you could say it was a crutch. It made me feel safe, or us feel safe. It was a very bright night. The visibility was excellent. But walking into the graveyard with the dark shadows looming over the stones, well, it was a hell of a creepy. We felt as if ghostly eyes were looking at us. The energy was oppressive, it was heavy. You couldn't hear a frog croak or a cricket chirp, so it was airy. I mean, that's not normal, is it? We began to walk through the trees, realizing an obscure, shadowy figure was stalking us. I knew it was the Bigfoot, but I guess I started to panic. I don't know why I got so frightened. I didn't see it clearly, only its huge, monstrous silhouette, its menacing red eyeshine, which scared the bejesus out of me. When it knew it had been seen, it started to run away, but in my moment of irrational panic, I unleashed a shot into the air. I must have hit it, as I could hear the most god-awful scream. The three of us hightailed it back to the house as fast as we could. We were wetting ourselves. We could hear a raucous scream emanating through the forest, as if someone else had watched us, and the scream put the fear of God into every fibre of our beings. We were very cross with Caden, said Zachary. He may be 15 years old, but he can do very stupid things sometimes. He always overreacts. It was a rather silly thing to do, I admitted, especially since the creature was running away from you. It certainly meant you no harm. You must seriously think wisely before you shoot at something at random. How can you be sure the Bigfoot female won't come back to hurt me? Asked Caden, his voice wobbling unsteadily. Because her little youngling is doing fine, I assured him, but also because I appeased her. I gave her a huge rose-quartz stone, which she absolutely loved. But I think you boys need to do something by way of apology. I've been doing some research for myself. I think you should gift the Bigfoot you hurt by leaving some glass marbles and a box of food in the woods for him, where you shot him. I believe it would be a nice thing for you to do. What sort of food? Asked Caden. Well, any whole food from nature, like dried fruit, peanut butter, jerky, fruit, nuts, stuff like that. We'll do it, said Caden. I've got some savings. I'll buy the Bigfoot some fabulous treats. To cut a long story short, my counsellor thought I was a miracle on two legs, because after the Bigfoot incident, I was able to resume my own life. I regained my job at the local school as a teacher, where I'd initially worked. Unfortunately, none of the residents remained living in that old Georgian house, as the landlord eventually sold it to a millionaire who wanted to restore it to its former glory, so that he and his tiny family could reside in a huge house that could easily swallow them whole based on its Goliath size. I am still in touch with those boys today, who are now lovely young men. We swore never to tell anyone about the Bigfoots we encountered. We want to protect them from human beings who might wish to cause them bodily harm. But in a discreet forum like this, it's nice to get our story told. From time to time I go to those gravestones. I put glass marbles around them. They're always gone when I return, so they're still out there in those woods. I'm sure of it. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. The rain came pelting down vigorously in large torrents. Transfixed, I watched it gliding down the window panes, covering the glass and spatters of opaque droplets. I could hear the swishing sound of the water gushing down the drain pipes, the distant rumbles of thunder. My uncle's golden retriever Carmel, undaunted by the growling bellicose smoky grey gloomy sky, was lying blissfully fast asleep on the flagstone floor of the very large, stylic, rustic-looking kitchen, with its bright red kitchen range, zooty kitchen cupboards, and golden-brown bespeckled granite islands. Not to mention the pièce de résistance, a huge wooden oak table, where I was now sitting. Carmel's long, soft, luxurious, creamy hair brushed against my feet, as a low snore emerged from the back of his throat. Everything in the yard was luxuriously green, the raindrops saturating the earth, causing even the turf to twinkle. It looked as if someone had turned on a power hose, washed all the dust away, for the plants and flowers looked brighter, crisper, greener, fresher, more vibrant from this rain. The clusters of spring daffodils were bowing their flowery heads, subserviently under the weight of the raindrops, while some of the beds of pansies looked like they'd taken a stiff beating. But once the sun burst through the cobalt-blue sky, and the grey sky finally receded, those flowers would look brighter, fresher than ever. I enjoyed staying at my uncle's Colorado ranch-style farmhouse, situated unapologetically in the midst of the glorious countryside, not too far away from a town, so in short a perfect location. Yet for me it was the indispensable consummate escapism that I was so desperately seeking. A true break from the chaotic chaos of my everyday life that seemed to swallow, devour, consume me with the gusto of a Californian wildfire. I deplored my job, a whole world away from the spectacular Colorado ranch, in the city of Boston, with a fervent passion, working for a demanding boss, as his personal secretary, who insisted on meeting last-minute deadlines, even if it meant quite literally that I was tearing my hair out in frustration. It would seem the daunting, all-consuming, unabating workload never seemed to stop piling up like the dirty sports gear in a very active footballer's laundry basket. There were times I had felt so weighted down, encumbered, overwhelmed by the work, that I had secret fantasies of just marching into my boss's office with a feisty swagger, just throwing the files on his desk and saying, "Sorry, Mr. Falconer, but I've just had enough. You can stuff your job, put it where the sun doesn't shine." I could visualize the pain expression on his face as I stomped belligerently out of the offices, with everyone in the open space area gawking at me in horror, as if to say, "What the hell was all that about?" as I finally left the building for good, never ever to return. The reality was very different. As much as I despised my nondescript mediocre job,
I knew I needed it. The pay was excellent. If I gave it up to embrace pastures new, I might not be able to afford to maintain my high standard of living that I had grown accustomed to over the years. But being miserable, depressed, permanently exhausted had become a fixture and fitting in my life. Of course, everyone on the outside looking in at my life, through the dewy, fragrant, beguiling sham of rose-tinted glass windows, clearly admired my lavish, sumptuous, luxurious lifestyle, falsely assuming that I had it all, the entire world at my feet. For on its elusive, enticing surface it would certainly seem that way. But then, on the surface, appearances can be exceedingly deceptive, a disingenuous, perfidious deception that you can never take at its word, or even at a fleeting glance. For not all that you see with your naked eye, or gleam on social media, is in fact as it seems. The envious looks on the faces of my friends had not escaped me, even when I drove my glamorous British racing green Jaguar down the streets of Boston. I knew that my image looked good, but that was all it was, image. As King Solomon rightly proclaimed, it was all meaningless under the sun. I could see admiring glances from people who clearly thought I was an affluent businesswoman who had absolutely everything. How wrong they were, how misguided, how misinformed. Sometimes I felt so empty, as if everything had been sucked out of me, like I was a dried-out old empty shell, robotically going through the motions of my life with a mechanical efficiency. In truth, a robot would have done a much better job than I had done. In reality, I was no more than a pathetic, glorified secretary with a fancy name, assistant director, that looked the part of a successful business executive in my smart, well-fitting Prada suits and stylish pumps. I was being paid a lot to perform like a hamster on a wheel, going round and round and round and round every day, with the same boring, drudgerous routines that made my whirling head want to explode with frustration. Worse still, both my parents loved to gloat on my account, on my so-called success. They hungrily basked in it like a pair of gluttonous Komodo dragons, shamelessly boasting about my insipid accomplishments, which were in truth as colourless as water, as bland as unsalted, flavourless popcorn. "Oh, meet my daughter," my effusive mother would gush to her listening audience, when I was at affluent social gatherings with them, like cocktail parties or barbecues. "This is my oldest daughter, Felicia. She works for the top CEO at PricewaterhouseCoopers in Seaport Boulevard." I could see my mother's chest inflate and swell with pride as she made those gainful innuendos. I would literally squirm with embarrassment, wishing that the whole ground would swallow me whole, as my mother would bumptiously brag on and on, like a washing machine at a laundromat, about my long list of masterful accomplishments that I myself did not know I'd achieved. For it would seem my mother's exaggerating tongue had run away with her, and seriously lengthened my success like the string on a piece of chewing gum that went on and on and on forever until it disappeared into the ether. The only person that I could genuinely talk to when it came to my crumbling, dilapidated life was my cousin Cynthia. She seemed to get it. She was a country girl who lived on her father's Californian cattle ranch, and would often come to Boston to stay with my mother's older sister Gretchen, who also lived there. I met up with her in town at a really trendy coffee shop 4 weeks prior, after she just came back from an exciting trip to Africa, where she had visited the Serengeti, lounged on some of Kenya's most illustrious beaches. I'd noticed that she was positively glowing from her holiday, as her skin gleamed with a natural golden tan. Her demeanour was relaxed and carefree, like the wind on a sandy beach. "Oh, there you are," she had said, rushing over enthusiastically to embrace me with a warm, energetic hug, as she threw off her overcoat on the back of the chair to sit down. She stared at me through concerned brown eyes. "You don't look good, Felicia. You're so pale and gaunt-looking. Are you sure you're all right?" "It's the work," I sighed, shrugging my shoulders in a nonchalant way. "It gets on top of me at times." All of a sudden I started to cry. This was a turn-up for the books. Even I was shocked by the sudden, unexpected emotional outburst, as rivers of tears bounded down my face at an alarming pace. It was very humiliating. Cynthia quickly opened her purse to grab some tissues for me to blot my eyes. I could hear the soft murmur of the people's voices rising and falling in the background, the sound of cutlery and china clanging, tinkling, clinking, along with the scuttle of the rushed feet of the waitresses as they hastily hurried across the cafe floor,
to take the detailed orders from the hungry people with an impressive efficiency. "There," she said. "There you are. Your mascara's running all over the place." She dampened the tissue with her tongue, wiping away the clouds of black that had now dappled my cheeks in a contemporary design of smoky blotches and splashes that might have looked good on an artist's canvas, but not my face. "Things can't be that bad, surely." "I hate my job, Cynthia," I said to her, almost growling. "I bloody hate it. If you must know, I keep dreaming of throwing the entire filing cabinet at Mr. Falconer, telling him to go and suck eggs. I wish I could leave that god-awful job. I feel as if I'm trapped under a falling building, like I'm suffocating from the claustrophobic oppression, that I can't breathe. I just want to scream, scream and scream. I feel so overwhelmed. The pressure of meeting all these deadlines, it's immense. It's stressing me out, seriously." "You poor thing," said Cynthia, telling the waitress to bring me a tall glass of Mountain Dew as quickly as possible. "Your mother's always going on to my mother about your dazzling achievements, how terribly proud she is that you work for such an illustrious company like PricewaterhouseCoopers in such a prominent high-profile position, driving around in your fancy Jag, wearing designer clothes, owning an apartment on the harbour. She seems to think you love your job, and that you're a huge, huge success." "Success," I sniggered, as if the word was odious and vile. I wanted to spit it out like a bitter piece of fruit. "You know, my mother is so pretentious. It's absolutely pathetic. The truth is, Cynthia, anyone could do my job. Absolutely anyone. It's that mediocre, that uninspiring. I hate it. I actually hate it. In fact, hate is an injustice to the word. I despise it. I loathe it." Once again I surprised myself with more unexpected streams of tears washing down my face that completely obliterated my makeup, leaving my now mottled skin covered in ugly pink wheals. But this time many people in the coffee shop were glancing awkwardly in my direction, pretending not to look, but not being desperately discreet enough to conceal their curiosity. They were staring at me with concerned expressions on their faces, as after all, why would anyone wearing a Prada suit, Prada pumps, and a matching Prada purse have anything to be sad about at all? "Is she going to be all right?" the waitress asked Cynthia. "Maybe a piece of chocolate cake would do the trick. Chocolate is great for grief." "Good idea," said Cynthia. "In that case, bring her the biggest piece of chocolate cake you've got." It would seem the waitress took my cousin literally at her word, for a slice of cake the size of a family pizza was placed in front of me, that caused a few eyebrows in the neighbouring tables to be raised. I even heard one woman saying, "Is she really going to eat all that?" Even I had to smile to myself as I stared down at the monstrosity before me, a very nice-looking one, with layers of fudge icing, whipped cream, copious, fat, juicy cherries marinated in brandy. I took a bite. I felt infinitely better about the world, as the sweet, lofty richness of the cake seemed to calm down my frazzled nerves. "You know what you need," said Cynthia, looking at me earnestly. "You need a good holiday, a break from your life in Boston. You're probably right, but my job is so busy. I can't take time off. Mr. Falconer really needs me." "That is so ridiculous," said Cynthia, growing heated as her angry face became flushed with a bright pink hue. "You're going to take time off. You hear me? You need a break from your job for your own good. If you carry on this way, you're going to have a nervous breakdown. I can't sit back and watch that happen to you. I tell you what, in 4 weeks' time our family is going abroad for 3 weeks. Why don't you move into our ranch house in Colorado? No one will disturb you. The ranch hands are in full control of running the ranch. They take care of the cattle, manning the affairs of the farm. Our ranch house is in a private space away from the working ranch, so you can stay there with Carmiel, our golden retriever, and our 2 cats for company. You'll have your own space, be able to go out for country walks, do your own thing. No one will disturb you. You need this time to be with yourself. It's very important." "It sounds like a great idea," I said, "but—" "No buts," said Cynthia, grabbing my hands. "Do you listen to me? No buts. You'll be house-sitting Carmiel, along with our 2 lackadaisical cats, but at the same time you'll have time to reflect on your life, so that when you return to Boston you can then decide whether you want to continue working for Mr. Falconer. I promise you, with some fresh air, gentle exercise, time to be quiet with yourself, you'll soon be able to decide what is best for you. In your current emotional state, your thoughts are flying all over the place like a dodgy electric connection that's firing up all wrong. You need some serious grounding, girl. Nature can do that for you, give you some meaningful perspective. Fast forward 4 weeks, and I had agreed to my cousin Cynthia's preposterous proposal that had not been so preposterous after all. On the contrary, a week into my holiday, I was beginning to really feel the benefits of being able to relax, to drink in the ravishing scenery that surrounded my uncle's home. It was wonderful to wake up, potter around the kitchen casually in my slippers, to stroke Carmiel's soft hair, get caught up with reading a novel or two on the sun lounger, take the occasional stroll in the woodgrove that framed the right-hand side of the house. Cynthia had been right. The ranch hands had given me a wide girth, left me to my own devices, were managing the ranch superbly without even a fleeting glance from me. It would appear my uncle's stunning ranch-style home, fringed by a magnificent woodgrove, along with Carmiel, the adorable, loving golden retriever, that made me feel comfortable, secure and protected, were my sanctuary for the next 3 weeks. There were a couple of old cats that mooched on the sofa all day long, that were also good company for me, as they enjoyed rolling on their backs, while I massaged their soft, fluffy underbellies, purring like little car engines. Let me assure you that a spot of laziness is very good for the soul. I was lapping it up hungrily, like a sea sponge, as I had not felt this free for a long time. I felt as if the weight of the world had been lifted from my shoulders, and that my hectic working life at PricewaterhouseCoopers was a distant, faint, obscure memory on the horizon. Unfortunately, Cynthia wasn't able to go abroad with her parents after all, as after her trip to Africa she had contracted hepatitis. She was convalescing with her Aunt Gretchen in Boston, was subsequently in quarantine. I did wonder if I might have been subjected to the virus, as after all I was up close and personal with her in that coffee shop, but so far I didn't have any physical symptoms to suggest that I could have caught it, although I had noticed that I was avoiding eating anything rich, as any fatty food brought on feelings of nausea, while my nose-diving appetite had seriously diminished. But I just shrugged my shoulders, putting those absurd, incongruous anomalies down to a change of season and environment. Gretchen had informed me that Cynthia had been placed on a non-fat diet for her liver, was not allowed to drink any alcohol whatsoever, and had also lost a ton of weight from the hepatitis, but she was doing exceedingly well. The doctor had assured her of an excellent full recovery. I continued to watch the rain as I leaned down to stroke the sleeping dog at my feet. Carmiel was a devoted golden retriever that was getting on in years, but he loved lounging around people. Over the last week the two of us had grown very close. "We'll go for a walk just now," I assured him, "once the rain has abated." At the word walk, Carmiel raised his head from his sleeping position to look at me devotedly through brown eager eyes, while his long blonde tail thumped on the floor. It was spring in Colorado, a truly mesmerizing time of the year. I was watching the world before my eyes transform into an artist's palette of pretty spring colours, especially observed in the pink blossoms of the crabapple trees that were illustriously crowned in an ocean of ethereal petals. "Are you coming?" I called out to Carmiel, who raced eagerly towards me, out from under the canopy of the oak table, to make his place firmly at my side. I opened and closed the front door behind me, as I clicked it in the lock, while I placed the key under the doormat. We eagerly ambled towards the woodgrove, that consisted of tall, statuesque ponderosa pines and spruce trees that penciled into the sky like vertical Christmas trees. After the rain, the forest smelt incredible, with the smell of earth mixed with the fragrant infusion of the sweet butterscotch-like scents of the ponderosa pines. The forest floor was strewn with glorious-looking lacy ferns, flowering shrubs, the occasional fallen tree trunk that looked like sculptural benches, swathed in carpets of luxurious, rich, velvety green moss. I could hear the tweets of the birds, observed the occasional squirrel with curious brown eyes darting up a tree trunk. All of a sudden I became dithery, confused, vague, disorientated. The only way I can describe the strange, outlandish feeling is when you've become inebriated, you've lost your mental and physical orientation. It was as if the forest had become like a rocking boat, and I could see that I had lost my stability. Everything was swaying backwards and forwards. Even the trees in the forest became a whirl of colourful dots. I knew something was wrong. What was happening to me? I could feel the sweat breaking out on my forehead, and after that I remembered nothing. I imagine I must have passed out, lost consciousness, collapsed on the forest floor. It felt as if I was locked in some weird dream from which I was trying to awaken, as I drifted in and out of consciousness. I vaguely remember sensing my environment. It seemed strange, but the sight of Carmiel lying by my side, licking my hand, was very reassuring, very comforting. Through my sleeping eyes I opened them slightly to see that I was lying on the scratchy straw, inside a homespun-looking shelter made of broken timber and the boughs of a ponderosa pine tree. I could see the familiar needles laced between the trunks that created a large, fragrant canopy over my head that was sheltered from the outside elements, as the floor in this shelter was completely bone dry. I could hear the reassuring pitter-patter of the rain thrashing down outside, but I wasn't uncomfortable by any manner of means, as wrapped up in the cosy confines of this peculiar sheltered nest was strangely snug. Yet I knew I wasn't dreaming. But what on earth was I doing in this bizarre, idiosyncratic place? Where on earth was I? That was when I saw her. I knew at once she was a Bigfoot. Although having lived in Boston all my life, people have put down such anomalous, fictitious creatures as being just stuff of legends. For a university town like Boston, you naturally get those studious academic types, so caught up in their silken, silvery spiderwebs, comprised of the building blocks of intelligent, rational thought and reason, that is so clouded, veiled by their judicious ability to see beyond scientific fact and reason. For these people, the very notion of a Bigfoot existing isn't remotely fathomable, but they were wrong, because the creature that had taken me into the shelter was a Bigfoot without question. With my soaring high temperatures, I was a little delirious, so focusing on her was wrought with its challenges. At first she seemed like a massive fuzzy blur of black hair, but as my eyes acclimatized to this moving, obscure humanoid silhouette that seemed to be fussing around me like a frenzied bee, I could see her shape more clearly. She was tall, imposing, lanky, powerfully built, with overlong arms, a pyramid-shaped head, and a small pair of pert breasts. It was her kind, gentle, feminine face that seized my attention. It was so uncannily human, with a leathery grey skin, deeply furrowed forehead, and deep-set dark brown eyes that seemed intelligent and very earnest. I think it was very significant that Carmiel was completely comfortable in her presence, unfazed, undaunted, unintimidated by the creature. On the contrary, as she drifted in and out of the wooded shelter, Carmiel seemed to follow her around like a besotted puppy dog. In my sleep I often discerned happy woofs, along with a chattering sound, as if the creature was talking affectionately to the dog, as if in some way they had developed an unlikely attachment together. I think the Bigfoot was bewildered to see my eyes flickering open and focusing directly on her. She came towards me, and I could feel the fragrant smell of mulched ponderosa pine leaves being rubbed on my forehead. They smelt fragrant and were strangely cooling. It felt like a pleasant treatment in a beauty salon. I've since learnt that pine is so good for fevers and inflammation when applied topically. I don't know how long I was with this creature, as sometimes I would feel my lips being saturated by water which she poured into my mouth, or I would taste the rich sweetness of a crushed berry on my tongue, which I would always gratefully swallow. There was a time that 3 shadowy Bigfoot creatures stood around me like 3 burly tree trunks, studying me with concerned expressions on their faces. I remember them having a conversation about me, but it's all so vague, indeterminate, blurred in my memory. I could hear them talking backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, and backwards and forwards in an audible indigenous language, but the voices were muffled, indistinct, and I was caught up in my feverish state, where I drifted in and out of my dreams, only sometimes glancing into reality for a second when my fever plummeted. But despite everything, I just knew I was safe. I could feel those eccentric creatures taking care of me. I remember the largest Bigfoot almost seemed like a medicine man. He placed a stone in my hands which felt cold to the touch, like a rose quartz, along with a necklace of eagle's feathers around my neck. I know that because my hand would touch them and I could feel they were feathers. While all these creatures stood around me, placing their hands on me like a Reiki healing session, I do remember experiencing an idiomatic rush of warm energy pulsing through my body. The following day, after the queer, rather absurd ritual, I was lifted out of my feverish state quite miraculously, glancing down at myself to see that I was covered in a deer pelt. I looked up to see Carmiel by my side, her twinkling, devoted, loving brown eyes focusing on me intently, while her tail wagged profusely, thrashing the ground exuberantly. When she saw I'd awoken, she darted out of the timber tent and began to bark excitedly, as if to alert the Bigfoot to my astonishing recovery. As if on cue, the Bigfoot came rushing into the nest, with Carmiel by her side. a set of bright, sparkling brown eyes fixed excitedly upon me. She darted over me to feel my head. I think my fever had subsided, because I suddenly felt a whole lot better. I realized I was hungry. Then the Bigfoot brought me some honey and berries, and I began to eat. She said a few words to me that I didn't understand, but I knew they were kind and gentle. I got up and the Bigfoot walked by my side as I made my way back to the ranch, staggering a little uneasily on my feet, but the Bigfoot held me up as I walked. She watched me as I opened the front door with Carmiel by my side. Then she nodded and simply glided away. Imagine my surprise to realize a whole week had gone by where I'd been nursed by a Bigfoot, for when I checked my calendar it had been a Thursday. Now it was the Friday of the following week. It would seem the ranch hands who had left me alone to my own devices had been blindly oblivious to my absence on the ranch. It was clear that Carmiel had been fed by the female Bigfoot, because when I gave her a bowl of kibble, she looked very disheartened, as if to say, "Where is the prime steak?" As for the two fat cats, they were lying across the couch. I noticed carcasses of a few half-eaten mice lying around the place, so they too had managed to take care of themselves while I was indisposed. It was when I discovered that my skin had grown bright yellow, that my urine was the colour of Coca-Cola, that I realised that I did indeed have yellow jaundice, or hepatitis if you like. I'd obviously caught it from my cousin Cynthia at the coffee shop, but even though I was infectious, I was feeling a whole lot better, and was placed in quarantine for a couple of weeks, where I remained in isolation on the ranch. It would seem every time I went for a walk in the woods, Carmiel would start barking loudly. The gentle Bigfoot would reappear. She would come out of the bushes from nowhere, rushing excitedly towards the dog, cradling Carmiel lovingly in her arms, rubbing her face in his coat. I realized that during my sickness, Carmiel and this unlikely creature had certainly formed an incredible bond. The Bigfoot looked at me. Our eyes met. She was so lovely. Her eyes twinkled with pleasure as she studied me. She seemed so happy to see that I was better. She pointed to me and let out a few happy whoops, along with words in a language I didn't understand. I decided that I needed to thank the creature for her extreme kindness towards me, so I ordered some groceries from town, took them into the forest for the Bigfoot in a large box, as I knew this creature had saved my life. For if I'd been lying in the forest unconscious, there is no telling what could have happened to me. I could have been drowned by the rain, attacked by a mountain lion, or eaten by some hungry coyotes. On the day that I'd brought the box of goodies for the Bigfoot in the woods, as I'd expected, Carmiel began to bark and bark to get her attention. And there she was, emerging through the trees, her lofty body, so graceful, so elegant, as she moved towards us as though she was floating. I put the box in front of her, indicated that it was for her. At first she seemed bashful, resistant, shy, reluctant. She moved cautiously towards the box, as if worried that it might actually bite her. She opened it up warily and began to sniff at the different packages, tossing them up in her hand like tennis balls, and then opening some of the cellophane containers, sampling some of the offerings. She pulled out the package of dried fruits, the nuts, the bottles of honey, peanut butter, jelly, cookies, and a vast selection of flavoured popcorns and chips. The creature was so enthused she began to whoop jubilantly, jumping up and down on her legs like an exuberant puppy dog. She opened the honey and cinnamon popcorn, popping it into her mouth, crunching it happily, and making appreciative, ecstatic ah sounds. And then she picked up the box and glided away. The first day I returned to work at the offices in Boston for Mr. Falconer, it really was unpleasant to be back. Within the first week, the files were once again piling up, and once again I was swamped with work. I returned home, glanced around my flat, and although swathed in exquisite decor, it had lost its lustrous shine. The next day while I was at work, I suddenly decided that I'd had enough. I walked into Mr. Falconer's office, placing the files on his desk. "I can't do this any more," I told him. "I've had enough. I quit." Mr. Falconer looked up at me in astonishment. "I don't understand," he quivered. "You've everything, a top job, an excellent salary. Why would you throw it all away like this?" "Because, Mr. Falconer," I said, "you'll be surprised to know that there are some things in life far more valuable than a hefty pay package. My happiness is worth a hell of a lot more than your pathetic job. I'm glad to inform you that I found a fabulous job working in an art gallery, which I enjoyed so much. Granted, I wasn't being paid the kind of salary as before, so my Jaguar and harbour-front property were gone, but so was the turmoil, the distress of my job. I realised my happiness was so much more valuable than any stuffy job could ever be. As you can imagine, my mother wasn't desperately enamoured by my falling off the pedestal of my so-called prominent, prestigious career. So I had to put up with her hangdog expression for a while, but I certainly didn't care. I never told anyone about the week on a cattle ranch that I'd spent in a Bigfoot's Nest. There would be too much, I can assure you, for people to get their heads around here, especially in a university town like Boston that would think such an outrageous claim was nonsensical and ridiculous. I was informed that for 3 weeks after I'd left the ranch, Carmiel kept visiting the woodgrove until she died. No prizes for guessing who she was visiting. So there you are. That's my story.
Anyway, the story tonight comes from a lovely lady, and this is what she's sharing with us today, and you are going to love the story. I know I did. So let's get started. Dear Sarah, my name is Jeanette, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in the year 1987, somewhere here in North America, but I don't want to say exactly where. Let me tell you my story, though, and how I came to encounter the hairy man, otherwise known as Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I grew up in a very abusive household. My mother was always high on drugs, and my father was a shameless alcoholic. I was an only child, and I grew up feeling ashamed of both of my parents. I'm afraid to say they were a huge embarrassment to me. I was frightened to tell anybody what was going on in my household because I was so terrified that social services would get involved in my situation. And I truly did not fancy the idea of being one of those children that hopped from one foster home to another. I knew of situations like that, and they weren't good stories. I really believed that even though I was in a bad situation, if I went and lived in a foster home, I would be far worse off than with my dysfunctional parents. It was normal for me to come home to literally find my mother passed out on drugs, lying on the couch, completely spaced out in another world. And then my father I would find watching sports games on television in a drunken stupor. I remember that the living room became like a dumping ground for battered beer cans and leftover takeaways. It was disgusting. Sometimes I felt like I was the only adult in my house. With the money from my paper round, I would buy my own food and anything else that I might need. Otherwise, there was nothing in the house. My parents lived off state disability benefits, which they managed to claim, I don't know how, and most of these benefits were spent on alcohol and drugs. My mother was as skinny as a rake because she just took drugs and barely ever ate a thing. I sometimes wonder why she was still alive because she was so emaciated and her skin was pale and pasty and grey, dulled by the substance abuse. She would have looked perfect playing a part on those zombie movies because she looked just like one of them, so much so in fact that she could have been given the leading part. My dad was also extremely thin and emaciated, but his stomach was the size of a pregnant woman who was expecting triplets because his liver was so badly inflamed and he was already suffering from the early stages of cirrhosis of the liver. The side effects of this alcohol abuse made him aggressive and abusive and sometimes even violent. And some of the nasty things he said to me are not repeatable to any of your listeners. When I would go home, I would go to my bedroom and lock the door behind me because I wanted as little contact with my parents as possible. I would always look forward to going to school and would eagerly catch the earliest bus in the morning. I remember always dreading the school holidays because it meant that I was shut in the house with two very insane parents that I hated being around. I adored my school friends and I would dread coming home from school every single day. I would literally have to pace myself before I opened the front door because I never knew what I would find. Maybe my mother would be wobbling around the house, speaking in a slurred voice, or she might even be dead. Nothing would have surprised me. I was the girl at school with the holes in my socks and wearing the faded dress that was way too short that I had outgrown a long time ago. Luckily, I had the nicest friends. They never commented about the state of my clothes or how old they were, nor did they ask me any awkward questions.
but they would have been blind not to notice how impoverished I was. I envied my friends with their perfectly packed lunchboxes, their new-looking clothes, and their seemingly perfect lives. If I went to a friend's house for a birthday party or some other occasion, I was just so shocked how some people had the most wonderful lives and parents who loved and adored them and looked out for their best interests. Sometimes my friends would be mad about being grounded or something, and I would think how lucky they were to have parents who truly loved them and enough to set boundaries. Mine never cared a jot about what I did. Even though I was sad about my plight, I did not allow it to get me down or to discourage me in any way. I tried to be as resourceful as I could to make money as a young girl by offering my services to neighbours in doing odd jobs like washing cars or weeding the garden or even painting something, which they would pay me for. I would never get any money from my parents. As for my family home, it was an embarrassment and a sight to behold. I think our nearest neighbour did not like living next door to our house because it was literally falling apart, with shabby, dirty curtains and threadbare furniture and an overgrown garden that had not seen a lawnmower for years, while their gardens, by contrast, were beautifully manicured and maintained with perfectly mown lawns and beds of beautiful blooming flowers. I could not wait until I finally was old enough to legally leave home and get a job all of my own to support myself. When that day did finally arrive and I got a job as a waitress at a restaurant in the town that was always so busy because the food was so delicious and they were open until late in the evening, they made the best burgers in town and the most delicious smoked meat sandwiches you've ever tasted. I was so excited about my future prospects. I could not afford a place of my own, but I had learnt from a friend of mine of a house that had been recently abandoned for a pretty long while, and yet the good news was the power was still working, which was extraordinary. The house was fairly close to where I attended school, so everything looked pretty promising. I was so desperate to leave my home and all that unhappiness and desperate loneliness behind me that I had felt growing up. I decided that I would move into this abandoned house and clean it up as much as I possibly could until I could finally afford to rent out my own place. In other words, I was about to become a squatter, I suppose, a word I've never liked. I took a trip in a bus that stopped almost yards away from the abandoned house that I hadn't visited before. I had left a note for my parents telling them that I had left home for good and had no intention of coming back, and that I hoped they had great lives. I doubt that they would have even cared that I had left or even noticed that much for that matter. All I had with me was a bag of cleaning products, a little food and a suitcase filled with second-hand clothing that I had recently bought from a thrift shop, which was a much better upgrade than any of my old clothes. When I arrived at the property, I was shocked by how overgrown it was. I wasn't expecting it to be this bad. It truly was a rambling thicket of vegetation that had definitely seen better days. There were lots of trees on the property that ended up becoming more uniform towards the northern side, looking like it bordered out into a larger wooded area. The surrounding valleys and countryside in the distance were all densely forested, and I knew that there were lakes, streams, and plentiful wildlife in the area, from white-tailed deers to hogs and the usual predators that you get in these parts. The house was a very long bungalow that was spacious, but a lot of the furniture had been removed, but there still were odds and ends lying around the place that had clearly belonged to the previous owner. The house was big enough for a whole family, but I just got the impression it had belonged to a single man, and I could not help wondering why he had left and abandoned this lovely home of his. I saw an old photograph of a gentleman in a frame that lay upside down on the floor, and I picked it up and looked at it, imagining that this was the man who had once owned the house. The picture was that of a handsome-looking man in his early 30s who appeared to be wearing tennis shoes and holding a racket in his hands. I really got the impression that he looked like a nice bloke who was a little bit on the shy side. The kitchen area was extremely impressive and looked almost new, with its fancy wooden cupboards, central island and fancy gas hob.
When I went to the main room, where there was no furniture at all, as if the whole room had been cleared out completely, so much so in fact that I swear I could smell the telltale signs of heavy-duty cleaning materials that still lingered in the air. Suddenly I felt this awful sense of foreboding, and I just knew instinctively that something remarkably bad had happened here. But what it was, I couldn't say. Then I saw it. The very thing that confirmed my worst nightmare about this bedroom. On an area of floor, marking what I imagine was where a dead body had once lain, were the telltale signs of that yellow tape with black writing saying crime scene. I could see what appeared to be an area on the wooden floor that almost looked like a stain from what may have been a decomposing body or maybe a blood stain of some kind. I did not know. I also found a piece of paper that may have been written by a medical examiner or a police officer lying on the floor. Most of the note I did not understand, but there was one sentence that got my attention almost immediately, and it said, "Large laceration to the side of the neck." I knew that something bad had transpired in this house, and that someone had clearly been murdered. But why was the house still abandoned? In that moment, I did feel that sense of impending doom and desire to leave this place almost at once. But no matter how tarnished this place may be, I just knew that going home was not an option for me. You would think I would just get back on the bus and go back home, but you would need to understand how desperate I was to get away from my awful parents. I had dreamt of this day for so long, and I was not about to give up on my dreams, not even now. Even though someone was murdered on this premises, nothing was going to stop me from making this a roof over my heads for the next few months, until I had saved enough money to rent out my own place. I just closed the crime scene room and decided never to venture in there ever again. But I spent the next few days cleaning the rest of the house. I scrubbed the whole place from top to bottom until my hands ached with pain. I cleaned windows and washed floors and hoovered carpets because the electrics were still working. The place was beginning to feel more like a home, and it was a wonderful feeling to be away from my parents, and for the first time in my life, I began to feel free. One day while I was busy cleaning, I heard a young girl sobbing outside. She was sitting on the front porch, and I did not know whether to go out and comfort her or to remain hidden inside the abandoned house. I had no idea who she was or what she was doing on the property, and I did wonder why she was crying. Eventually I decided to go out onto the wooden deck to comfort the girl who was sitting on one of the steps. "Are you all right?" I asked. "I just heard you crying." The girl looked startled. "Who are you?" she asked. "I suppose I'm what you might call a squatter," I said. "I'm kind of living here." "Are you kidding?" she said, wiping away her tears. "You do know what happened here." "Someone was murdered, you know." "Well," I said, "I did see some crime tape in the bedroom, so I guess someone had been found dead here." The girl looked at me with a puzzled expression on her face. "You would live in a place like this after knowing that someone was killed violently here?" she asked. I was surprised by my own frank response. "Well, I'm desperate," I exclaimed. "You must be," said the girl, looking at me startled. "You'd have to pay me to live in Uncle Matt's home after what happened to him." "Was this your Uncle Matt's home?" I asked in surprise. "Was it him who died in that room?" The girl nodded, and then she burst into uncontrollable sobs. "Get it all out," I said to her, cradling her into my arms and stroking her back. "Crying is the best way to heal," I told her. After the girl stopped sobbing, she looked up at me and said, "Why him of all people? He was the nicest person I have ever known. Who would want to do such an evil thing to him?" "I saw his picture," I said. "He looked like an incredibly nice guy." "I found him, you know," said the girl. "I always popped in to see him once or twice a week." The girl proceeded to tell me how the front door had been taken off its hinges, almost as if it had been yanked off by some violent force. "The police have never seen anything like this before," she exclaimed. "They said the break-ins do not happen like this." She proceeded to tell me how she knew when she saw the front door on the ground that something quite dreadful had happened to her uncle. He had only been dead for 4 hours when I found him, but the smell in that room was intolerable. I never knew a dead body could smell like a skunk. It was disgusting. Anyway, she continued, I rushed into his room and he was lying on the ground, motionless. I knew he was dead. His neck was broken with a huge gash on the side. Wow, I said, that's terrible. I'm so sorry for your loss. I came here today, said the girl, to make sense of everything, and of course to remember him, to be close to him, because this is where I spent time with him. Of course you did, I said. I'll get out of your way. Please don't, the girl begged. It's good to talk to someone about this. Did your uncle say anything about any enemies? I asked her curiously. Maybe someone who wanted to do him grievous bodily harm? Can I tell you something weird, she said. In the strictest of confidence, of course. Of course, I said. Go on, I'm all ears. Well, I don't know how to say this, and I know it's going to sound very strange, but it's really true. There was this very large man on the property once. I was with my uncle when I saw him. We both actually saw him. The only thing about him was that he was much bigger than a man would be. I've never seen a man that big. And he was covered with short black hair. We both saw him watching us from the tree line over there, and he was like a savage. He looked menacing and very scary, like an apex predator. He had this strange conical head and very long arms compared to ours. He also thumped his chest in front of us very aggressively, as if to tell us, I'm boss, not you. And he made this deep guttural sound, which was the most terrifying sound that either my uncle and I had ever heard. Did you tell the police about this? I asked. I tried to, but when I did, they just laughed at me, as if they thought I was making it all up. I want to find the killer as much as they do, but they didn't take me seriously at all. Oh dear, I said, that's terrible. Did you ever see the big hairy man again? I asked. No, but my uncle saw him from time to time, and he said things were getting seriously out of hand with the creature. He said that horrible hairy man had been banging his house and even throwing boulders at his front door and got him feeling incredibly intimidated. Are you sure about this? I asked in horror, wondering whether squatting at this property was such a good idea after all. You haven't seen any sightings of this hairy man again? She asked me. I'm willing to bet that he killed my uncle, and if he's still around, you could also be in danger. You realise that? I mean, this thing was a monster, and I'm not kidding you about that. I don't know if you're actually safe here. She started to hand me a bottle of mace. I brought it along in case I had any nasty encounters of my own, she said. But I think if you're going to be staying here, you're going to need it more than I do. I took the bottle of mace from the girl gratefully. You will come back? I asked. I've really enjoyed our chat. The girl nodded, and I watched her walk away. What an extraordinary story, I thought. 3 weeks passed by in the abandoned house, and I was thrilled that the electric still had not been cut off. It was wonderful leaving my parents and living all on my own. I had been saving a lot of money, and things were going exceedingly well for me. Every night after my waitressing stint, I would return home at about 12 o'clock and was given a lift by one of the waitresses that worked with me, who had her own car. One evening as I returned to the abandoned house, I sensed that something was watching me, and whatever it was incredibly unsettling. Suddenly I detected a movement in the brush of this dark, shadowy form with bright red eyes, at least 7 feet off the ground. I ran into the house and immediately bolted the doors and windows from the inside. Luckily, even the keys of the house were lying around, and the front door had long since been fixed, so at least I knew I was safely secure on the inside of the house. The thing, whatever it was, came thundering through the tree line like a bulldozer, and I could hear his heavy feet walking across the roof. He was making the most horrendous growls that were so terrifying I nearly jumped through my skin. My heart was pounding and I could do nothing to call for help because there were no phones on the property, and in those days we didn't have cell phones accessible to us. I've never felt so vulnerable and so afraid in all of my life, and I could hear this thing banging and pounding the front door, and suddenly I heard the hinge breaking, and I knew that this thing was after me. He would be in the house in seconds, and I knew I was in grave danger of losing my life. I remember that there was a bathroom window in the back that I believed I was slim enough to slide through, and so that is what I did. It is amazing what you can do when you are in grave danger. I suddenly heard the front door breaking off its hinges, and by that time I'd slipped out of the house as quietly as I could. I ran into the main road, and I was fortunate enough to flag down a passing driver, which was a miracle because it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and there were not many drivers out on the roads that late at night. The stranger asked me no awkward questions and proceeded to drop me at my parents' house. I kid you not, when I walked back into my family home, my parents barely acknowledged me, barely asked where I'd been, and did not even realize, I think, that I'd been living away from that home for several weeks. I never even returned to the abandoned house ever again, nor did I ever see the lovely niece of the deceased Uncle Matt. I had left all my minimal belongings in the house, including all my savings, but I knew I would never go back to get them. I am convinced that it was the creature killed the owner of the abandoned house, which I believe was a territorial Bigfoot who did not want anyone on the property. When he got a whiff of my presence, he was after me too, and I have no doubt that he would have killed me if he had got hold of me. I was so lucky to escape with my life, and for that I am truly grateful. It took me 2 long years to finally move out of my parents' house, but eventually within months of each other, they both died because of their addictive behaviours. My mother died of substance overdose, and my father eventually succumbed to cirrhosis of the liver. I'm happily married now with children of my own, and I truly cannot understand why my parents were so irresponsible and so incredibly uncaring. But I have forgiven them, as I have that hairy man, for attempting to harm me, because in my experience, carrying grudges can poison you very much and cause you too much grief in your own life. And I wanted to move on from all of that. So there you are. That's my story. Jeanette, I know that this is a very hard story for you have to share with anyone tonight. I cannot imagine what it must have been to actually move into a crime scene home and consider that preferable where someone's being murdered than staying with your own parents. And I just thank you so much also for having the incredible courage to send us this amazing story that really tugs at the heartstrings.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.